need to make a start, if that's okay with you. And welcome again to everybody, the vast majority of whom were here for the AGM, but a quarter of an hour ago. Let me just make one or two comments by way of introduction, but also apologies, which some of you have heard already. Let me first of all, and again, welcome Dave Bennett, who has now moved to that end of the table. Dave is a new non-executive director, officially joins us on the 2nd of October, but is taking the opportunity to be with us today, I suppose as part of his induction. We're delighted to have Dave join us. Amongst other things, Dave is currently a non-executive director for the Southampton University Hospitals Foundation Trust and has a very impressive portfolio of experience in public and private sector organisations. So we know, Dave, you'll be a major asset for us. We look forward to working with you. And let me run through again the apologies for today's meeting. They include Alison Bussey, our chief nurse, Dr. Julian Povey, GP partner member, Neil Carr, CEO, MPFT, Pauline Gibson, Ned for MPFT, Roger Dunshay, one of our non-executive directors, Louise Barnett, for whom we have John Jones, the medical director for SATH, sitting over on my left-hand side. John is deputising for Louise. And we've had apologies too from David Sidaway. Jonathan is here in his stead, I imagine. And also Sean Davis and Marianne Grant. Now, I might have missed somebody. If I have, I apologise, and we'll make sure that that's corrected and included within the minutes. Moving on. Just a few introductory remarks, if I may. First of all, an apology for the lateness of the papers for this meeting. Some of you will know that papers were published, as they usually are, on the Friday before the meeting, but for one of the papers there were some concerns about its content and how it had been presented, so the decision was made to withdraw it, and therefore all of the other papers, because of the way in which they're all bundled. I just want to make it absolutely clear that it's not our normal practice to have delays with the publication of papers. We've had a query from a member of the public about that, and I just want to take the opportunity to reassure everybody that was an extraordinary circumstance and should not happen again. In terms of the explanation for the paper concerned, I'll deal with that and comment on that when we get through to the agenda item number 13, so that you will understand more of the detail at that point. Let me also just make one or two other introductory comments, if I may. They used to say that summer was a quieter time in the life of the NHS and local government, but it never is it? It's been frantically busy, and I suppose this is the first meeting we've had post-summer holidays, really. And whilst we have been enjoying holidays, some of us at least, we've had a ramping up of doctors' industrial action, and I think, are you saying more about that in your report, Simon, thank you. There is the fallout from the Letby case, and we're going to be picking that up later in the meeting as well. It's already beginning to manifest itself in a number of important ways, not least of all the enhanced fit and proper person test, which we need to apply, and that is something that we're going to have to live with. We're going to have to manage that as best we can, but it's entirely understandable. We've also had continuing pressures for urgent and emergency care, but we'll pick that up, I guess, Claire, when we're talking about the finance and the integrated performance report. And we've got increasing and worrying financial pressures that we need to think about and talk about later during that item on the agenda as well. Now, there's 100 other things that have been happening, including, I should say, a really important meeting in public about the beds at Bishop's Castle Hospital. And I didn't want to go into the detail of that today because I know how important that is to many people, but I just wanted to acknowledge that Tina and Patricia have managed that meeting and the public concern about that as best as they possibly could under difficult circumstances, and there is a plan of action for moving forward with that particular issue, which as far as I can tell seems to have a good degree of public support in terms of the actions and the next steps. But there's a lot more work still to be done, and Cathy Pert, Chair of the Strategy Committee, who's also Ned for Shropcom, is nodding. So thank you for that as well. Okay. Let's move on, if you're okay with that. Declarations of interest, we did that for the AGM. I don't think I know of any adjustments that have been suggested to the register, so I take that as read. Can I ask you for your comments, acceptance, approval of the minutes of the last meeting? They get more Hansard-like as time goes by, don't they? So full meeting, full discussion. Are you happy that they represent a true and correct record? Let me refer to matters arising and the action checklist. I was reminded that we gave Claire Skidmore one or two quite challenging tasks within the action checklist, but I'll just quickly run through two or three which might be still outstanding. And the first one, Claire, was having discussions with programme board leads about progress and risks. That was meant to be done by now, and you'd be forgiven if it hasn't happened, but if it has, well done. Do you want to tell us where we're at with that?
I haven't personally had specific conversations with each of the programme leads, but I do think that activities since the last meeting have superseded that. So we have had focus in all of the areas we've held, or Harry has presided over the Integrated Delivery Committee, so that we've had confirm and challenge opportunities through there as well. So I can redouble and go round the loop and do that again, but I think at the moment we've got we have an agreement through chief execs this morning in terms of a way forward, in terms of some actions that I'd rather not kind of knock off course at this stage, because there's a lot for us to focus on already. Well,
unless anybody wants to propose a different tack, I suggest that we leave it at that. We assume that action as recorded is complete. The next one, again, it came out of the performance report. A kind of potential inconsistency in terms of the primary care. The number of GPs has increased, or the number of staff in primary care has increased, but the numbers of appointments seem to have gone down. Is there something in the primary care discussions that we're having later that picks that up, Claire?
I don't think there is, forgive me, I need to go back and just check that one with the team.
Let's do that. The Hewitt review, etc. I imagine we'll be picking up the inferences from the Hewitt review when we talk about the people strategy later, will we?
Well, there's the people strategy, but also I think the reshaping the ICB and the response to that all plays into that. So I think, if okay with you, Chair, and the board, I would suggest we close that action down as currently written, and then it will be the actions that come out of the ICB reshaping and the other bits that form that, because the Hewitt review is integral to that paper and that direction of travel.
Everybody happy with that approach? Thank you. The MSK transformation programme work, I saw Mike Carr, who's leading this earlier. You tell me where you think we're at, and I'll tell you what Mike Carr told me.
Okay.
I'm sure it'll be the same.
So myself and Stacey have talked about this in terms of where it's got to and the progress being made. Through that conversation, it felt absolutely appropriate that actually it became more of, we used it in the October for the development session because there's a wider conversation to have that we wouldn't be able to give it time and justice to in a public board meeting. Once we've then used it for the development session, the learning from that and the work that will have been progressed from that then comes back as a formal public update to the board meeting post that.
It deserves a decent amount of time for discussion, and that's exactly what Mike said to me. So entirely consistent, and if the board is happy with that, I suggest that's how we deal with it. Everybody okay with that? And then there's the people strategy update, etc., which we're coming to later on the agenda. Any other actions that people would have expected to have been recorded. Okay. So, questions from members of the public. Often at this point I say, well, we haven't had any questions, but I've had half a dozen or so, some of which overlap. And as you know the convention, we note the receipt of the questions and we reply to the individual questioners and produce a composite report for information for our next meeting. But there's a couple that I would just want to mention. One is the one question about the delay in the papers this time, and I've answered that in part, but we'll give a more fulsome response to the person who's raised the question. But the other is a really great news about a question about whether we would be congratulating Robert Jones and Agnes Hunt on their results in the CQC patient survey, whereby they have emerged as the best specialist hospital in the country.
Specialist trust.
Specialist
Not
trust.
Specialist, sorry.
I do apologise. She was very quick with that, wasn't she? But it's a fantastic achievement, and Harry and Stacey, please pass on our congratulations to your board and to your staff. Very well done. Very well done. There are other aspects of inpatient surveys for which we've had a question, and we'll deal with that in the way in which we try to deal with other questions as well, and the others as well. There's a couple about stroke services and rurality, just to give you a flavour of the kind of things which have come my way on this occasion. We'll deal with those in the usual way, all to be included as a response in a composite for our next meeting. Okay. Let's move into item 107, patient story, learning disabilities and autism services, and Luke's story. I think I'm asking, is it Gareth or Vanessa? Vanessa, would you like to introduce our guest and the topic?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sunil. Very warm welcome to Sarah Summers and Alan Simmons. Sarah is Luke's mum and is probably the best person to talk to us about the experience of care for people with learning disability and in the services which are offered in this country, not just in Telford and Wrekin. But also Alan is from the intensive support team, which is part of MPUFT, and the role that actually skilled practitioners can have in making sure the right people get the right care when they need it. So Sarah's very much going to talk about the impact of both health conditions and health decisions and teams around the person, and really talk about the importance of personalised care and communication with families and people to make sure they get what they need. And I'm going to hand straight over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much for inviting me here today to share Luke's story. It's a long and complex journey over many years, and it's very much summarised in the 20 minutes that I've got. But there is a video link there if you haven't seen the video, which I was asked to make by your trust in February of this year. This is Luke. Luke is just 34 even, and I'm going to share with you the core experiences of care that Luke has endured over many years. But I also want to share with you the highly positive support that we had from your intensive support team in September 22. They saved Luke's life. Whilst your authority is not funding Luke, Luke is not your responsibility and he is not in your area, I really would like you to consider, as I talk today, what oversight do you have to ensure that these experiences are not happening in your area. They can happen anywhere. I'm just going to give you a very brief summary of Luke's medical history. Luke was born healthy, he was a good weight, normal birth, he was a very happy baby, and his early milestones were advanced. Luke has very severe intractable epilepsy, and despite numerous drugs since the age of 2, he's never had control of his seizures. He started having seizures at 2.5, and as a child he had up to 40 in a 24-hour period. He also has high risk of SUDEP, and he always has a nurse with him 24/7. At 6, Luke had status seizures, and he had, over a 3-week period, hundreds of seizures and was unable to gain control. And from that time, his learning and behaviour regressed. He's had investigative brain surgery at King's College London. Unfortunately, they were unable to find the focal point of the seizures, so currently surgery is not an option for Luke. He's had numerous hospitalisations all over the country, miles from home, and Luke has been in induced coma 7 times in life-threatening conditions, and we were told he was at risk of death. He has extensive physical issues, and as a young adult, he had an emergency twisted bowel. He had part of his bowel removed, and then 4 days later it split open, and he had to have an emergency colostomy, which is now reversed. This has left him with considerable bowel issues, and he's always in discomfort, and he sometimes is in agonising pain. Luke has a learning disability, most likely from all those seizures. He has hemochromatosis. He had his first VNS at the age of 13 implanted. He's had a second one implanted since. He has autistic traits, although never formally diagnosed as autistic. I think he most probably is. And he suffers from considerable prenatal activity prior to seizures, and that can be 24 hours before, when he can become confused and there can be behaviour changes. Luke suffers huge anxiety and trauma from his physical health issues. Luke moved into the full-time care system as an adult, and he's had multiple placements, 17 in 13 years, and these are contrary to the transforming care agenda because they have all been miles from home. He has been exposed to a number of recognised failed services, and that is recognised. He was a patient at Winterbourne View, and I'm sure you're all familiar with Winterbourne View. He suffered and witnessed abuse and neglect. He was also a considerable witness in the criminal investigation for Winterbourne View. Luke is very verbal, he's intelligent, and he was interviewed by the police twice and videoed, and we are extremely proud of him for talking around his experiences. We were told after Winterbourne View that Luke would have the best possible care and it would be rigorously monitored. He went into 3 CQC judged inadequate settings. My husband and I consider there were many more that were inadequate. They weren't inspected when Luke was there. These 3 settings were closed, and Luke very rapidly had to be moved out of the settings, so there was no transition plan for him. Luke moved into the community in 2019, and he remains in the community with 24-hour care support. 2 independent reviews have been commissioned from August 19 to September 21 by the NHS in recognition of the failings during that period. We consider some of the placements before that period were even worse. Those independent reviews make very grim reading for anybody. As a parent, to read that your child, and he is my child, he might be 34, has suffered neglect and abuse by the very people who care for him has been devastating. And despite our serious concerns, we were not listened to. I'm very briefly going to give you some of the poor experiences. There are far more on the video. The placements in the inadequate settings, I do urge commissioners not to place people in inadequate settings and to have a very clear rationale if they are placed in requiring improvement settings, unless there is a rapid improvement. Providers consistently gave a glossy brochure but did not deliver what they had promised. Accommodation was not fit for purpose, and there's more on the video, and at times was shocking. Luke's physical health needs were neglected, and I think you've heard some of his physical needs. There was no annual review for over 10 years. And I have put there a link to MenCap around learning disability and health inequalities. There are long waiting times for specialists. Luke is waiting for a collectoral consultant. We've been told it'll be up to 60 months. And there's another link there around eliminating waiting times. One of the most frustrating things around Luke's poor experiences has been inconsistency of staffing. From years and years, it's written down, he must have a consistent staff team that he trusts. Unfortunately, he's had times in his community houses, his first 2 community houses, where strangers came into his house. They did not know his name, they did not know he suffered from epilepsy, they had not read the behaviour support plan, and they had no understanding of his emergency medication. Imagine how you would feel if 2 strangers came into your house. Luke has often been abused at night, and there were 2 people who didn't even know his name. Regularly, staff lacked the specialised skills needed, and few had epilepsy training. They didn't have trauma-informed training. We've been promised meaningful activities and trips out. We take Luke out every weekend when we visit. One setting he was in for 5 years, he had 6 trips out, apart from when we took him out. One of the most frustrating things was the poorly led meetings. We would travel 3 hours, my husband and I, to a CPA review, and we'd get there, there'd be no agenda, there'd be no introductions. We had no idea when we as parents were supposed to speak. We'd be presented with 15-page reports about Luke at the start of the meeting. We couldn't read them because the meeting had started. We'd get home and we'd say, if we'd known that had been written about Luke, we would have challenged. We had no opportunity to. Oh, thank you. You do that one. There were actions agreed at meetings and they never happened, including CTR, community treatment reviews. Actions were never taken forward. Labels were given to Luke, and for many, many years, and Alan found this when he came on board, that they were copying and pasting huge sections of reports from 10 years ago, not looking at the Luke now, just copying and pasting. There was inaccuracy of report writing, and we proved that, and got some reports changed. When Luke was first in the community, there were few visits by the provider. The clinical lead was in Glasgow. The team leader was in the south of England and had never met Luke for nearly 2 years. There was, and it is recognised in the review, there was a lack of oversight by the commissioners at the time in terms of monitoring the care and the safety of the package. And again, there were no visits when Luke was in the community to see the safety. There were no environmental checks. These poor experiences have been Luke's normal. He's had many years of not feeling safe and not being able to trust staff because of his experiences. He's suffered huge anxiety and trauma. His physical health has been neglected. And I think one of the saddest things is Luke has lost the quality of life, and his adult early life, he's now 34. He lost his freedom and he lost his choices. Because he was moved around so much because of these inadequate placements and had to be moved around, there was a lack of meaningful relationships apart from his immediate family. He missed out on many family occasions and events, including his brother's wedding. And for a long, long time, it's had a huge impact on us as a family, on our beloved son. But I'm now going to talk to you about the positive impact of your intensive support team. And Alan is here, who's very much part of that team. You have a small but highly skilled and dedicated team. Without them, Luke would have been condemned back into a low secure unit. Luke was in temporary and emergency accommodation in your area. As I said earlier, Luke is not your responsibility. He was referred to the IST, the Intensive Support Team, in September 22 to prevent his placement breaking down, and also he was at risk of going back into a low secure setting. We knew that was wrong. There'd been a number of safeguarding concerns which had been raised around the package. The intensive support team came in and they screened Luke, and they very quickly raised grave concerns about what was happening. At the time, there were restrictions in place. Since April 22 to September 22, Luke was being spoken to through a less than 8-inch hatch. His medication was being handed to him through the hatch. The support staff were not allowed to go into the house to Luke. They wanted to, but they'd been told they couldn't. The only way Luke could have human contact was to go in the garden. I will add, whenever we visited Luke, we took him out in the community and had a wonderful time. Your IST came in and they realised that things were very wrong. These restrictions were illegal and a substantive breach of human rights. They came in and they were so person-centred, and the first time really that we'd experienced that. Luke was at the centre of the care and the discussions, and for the first time there was positive language about Luke, and after years of deficit-based language, it was a joy to our ears. They really looked at the needs and the functions of Luke's behaviour, and of course he was desperately unhappy. For 5 months he'd been spoken to through a hatch, apart from when we visited. They ensured that the staff team were trained and fully trained in the behaviour support plan and in epilepsy training, and they really sort of that trauma-informed training, which was so important for Luke. And your IST team went in and visited Luke regularly. Remember, he'd been spoken through a hatch for 5 months. They went in, hour at a time, had a cup of coffee and a biscuit with him. They chatted to him, and they found the wonderful young man that we knew Luke was and is. They stripped away those negative labels. I don't know how they did it, but they went through copious reports, and they challenged the findings of those reports and the evidence base. They were, what I'd say, there was professional curiosity. They really forensically went through and challenged the evidence base. And something which so impressed us, and we think of so many times, is that they had the courage to make a decision independently, and they disagreed with many other people. The gatekeeping assessment did not want Luke to go into a secure setting, can I add as well. They worked very closely with the multi-agencies and shared their expertise. They attended MDT meetings, provider meetings, staff training meetings. They updated the behaviour support plan, they trained staff in it. And rather than saying, this incident happened and that was it, they really looked at the triggers. And many times it was because the care plan had not been followed. And Luke moved into his community, local community, in December 22, and your IST were instrumental in ensuring that transition plans were robust and rigorous. And that is the first time that that had happened. They went to the bungalow that Luke currently lives in, and the garden in the area, and they did risk assessments. That hadn't happened before. The first house Luke had in the community for a year, nobody had gone in and done any environmental checks or any risk assessments. And as I say, the management provider had left him there for a year with no checks and left him with young staff. They reviewed Luke's health needs. They understood that his health had been severely neglected. And they listened to us as parents. They involved us in meetings, and we felt believed. And they were very involved in the CTR, the Community Treatment Review, and it was acknowledged that your IST reports were of the highest quality. And I will never forget that CTR, having sat on many of them, and it was a very experienced panel that had been chosen because of the complexity of the situation. and they said it was the longest CTR they had ever undertaken, with the most recommendations, and they said it was shocking that care could be provided in the 21st century in this way. And the impact of the wonderful work of your IST is that Luke is now living in his own house in the community, in his bungalow which he loves and a garden that he loves. He's accessing the community. We've always taken him out in the community. He has the most wonderful, consistent staff team who love working with Luke, and he loves having them in his house. Behaviour support plan is followed. The few incidents are reviewed. Luke feels safe for the first time in many years. And the local MDT, the IST in our local area, the community team and the complex needs team, we're all working together for best outcomes for Luke. We are involved in every MDT meeting now. And the perception of Luke has changed. Positive language is used about Luke. And at the start of every MDT, his strengths are noticed first. And your IST saved Luke's life. And Luke is an inspirational, incredibly resilient and brave young man with a wonderful smile. And I would just like to finish with, you have a small IST, and we know there's a growing demand for services. We also know the number of children diagnosed as autistic in schools. And I do believe that there should be an investment in ISTs, both in your area but across the country, so that you're growing that team for prevention. It will save huge financial burden later on in very expensive hospital settings, which are totally ineffective on many occasions. I also believe a larger IST will enable high quality training for providers, care staff and parents, etc. And I do believe ISTs across the country need 24/7. A crisis happens on Christmas Day, a crisis happens at weekends, a crisis happens at 6 o'clock on a Friday night. And I do believe there should be a recognition of the impact of physical health needs on mental health for LDA, and that the waiting lists should be prioritised. As I said, 60 months for a collector or consultant, we've been told. And just to finish, this is Luke this summer. And you can see he's been growing broccoli, and you can see, I hope, a bit of the smile on the right-hand side. And just to finish, probably can't see that, I think you get the PowerPoint later. The top photograph was the 29th of August 22, Luke's birthday. He was under restrictions. We took him out on the bank holiday Monday with his brother and 2 young children and family. We took him to a garden centre. We took him out in a busy area for lunch. We took him back to his home. He was under restrictions again. And the only way he could have human contact on his birthday was to wrap up with a hat and a blanket, you may not be able to see that, jumpers, and sit in the garden until the early hours to have company in the evening of his birthday. The bottom 4 are just a joy, and if you do get the PowerPoint, you may be able to see. The 29th of August this year, 9 of us went to West Midlands Safari Park, including my son and family. You can see that Luke had a wonderful, wonderful time. That is impact, and thank you so very much. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very, very much indeed. Very moving, very brave of you to come here this afternoon and describe your experiences. We're incredibly grateful. I just want to throw it open for any comments, any observations that people might have. I suspect that many of us feel almost speechless, actually, in terms of that which we've heard from you. But let people speak for themselves. Any comments? Patricia, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Patricia Davies. I'm the Chief Exec for NHS, Shropshire NHS Community Trust, and the very proud aunt of 2 now adults, 24-year-old Daniel and Matthew, who have both been through the Transforming Care agenda. And so your story resonates very strongly. I mean, I completely agree.
Other comments? Thank you, Patricia. Tina, would you like to say who you are?
Thank you for a really moving and powerful story. And it's more a question for us as a board rather than to myself. But as Patricia said, Luke's experience sadly is probably not unique. So the question for us as a board is how are we assured that people that we have responsibility for are not undergoing similar experiences? I don't know.
Yeah, let me just take one. Let me just take one or two other comments or questions. Nitty, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you so much for that very moving story. I was the carer for my sister-in-law who also had a learning disability, and I had similar experiences. I'm a doctor, a GP. I had access to lots of care and similar experiences, so it kind of resonated. What you're saying very much resonated with me. Unfortunately, she passed away due to poorly neglected health conditions that we were pushing for many years ago. But just a comment and a question really, Neil, is that community services are often neglected, and what we are seeing is years and years of disinvestment in some of these services. And in terms of financials, the case really stacks up. So for us, it's not just about oversight, it's what we invest in as a healthcare system.
Thank you very much indeed. Any final comments as I try and draw together some of the thoughts I have and respond to some of the points you've made. We listened to many patient stories, client stories in this meeting, and many of us have listened to patient stories, client stories over many years in different board settings. I think I can say I've never been so moved as I have been by yours. Thank you very much indeed. Now, there's a really important point here, which is Tina's point. So what do we think we ought to do about this? I think now's not the time to start delving into the kind of things we should do, but I do think we need to return to this subject, and Simon will comment in a moment or two, at a reasonably, in a reasonable period of time, and think carefully about the things that we've learned, and think about actually the optimism and the triumph really that you've talked about because of the work of Alan and IST colleagues, for which we should be hugely grateful. In other words, there are ways in which these things can be managed, which we really, really need to focus upon. So Simon, do you want to add anything to that before we move on?
So thank you. Again, just to reiterate that, really powerful and really moving. And just to build on that proposal, Neil, a system our size, I think it would be absolutely appropriate for the board to ask for us to make sure that we have reviewed the residents that we've got in placements against the standards, given your feedback at the start. And so I would suggest we pick that up as an action and then bring back, and we'll decide whether that comes back to the public board in terms of, we'll need to look at the numbers and identification and making sure that we manage that in the right way, but through the right governance routes. So Gareth, Vanessa, I'm looking at the two of you, if we could do that, please, because I think what I don't want to do, Neil, is say, yes, we should come back to it on a regular basis. I think there should be an action that comes out of this discussion now. And given what's been flagged at the start, I think we've got a responsibility to just do that check and see where we get to.
Everybody happy with that proposed way forward? So finally, thanks again for coming. And Alan, really gratitude.
Quickly say something. I think the risk is that, and what happened with Luke is we lose the voice of the person at the centre, and we lose the voice of the family. And what happens is accumulative restrictions are applied that makes that person's world really small and doesn't recognise the challenges that they're going through, and they're trying to communicate through their behaviour. It just gets lost, and the focus is on managing a behaviour that's trying to communicate, I'm not happy. something is wrong with the care I'm delivering. So it's about listening to the person. It's about understanding that behaviour as a function and what that function is.
And I think if I interpret Simon's suggestion correctly, what we need to be doing is looking after people individually and asking ourselves about whether the care they're receiving is appropriate, and if it's not, how it can be improved. We get into discussions in this kind of board about grand strategies and implementation plans and all of that, but it tends to be at a higher level. What we're talking about here, as you rightly say, and what we've heard about with Luke, is an individual story. We need to be thinking about the individuals and how we can improve care for individuals. So thank you both very much indeed for coming, and we will keep in touch with you. And you must challenge us. You must keep challenging us. That's important, and we'll give you opportunities to be able to do that. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Wow. That was extraordinary, wasn't it? Okay. We just need to come back to that outside of the meeting and plan our response as a result of that. But we've got other issues to discuss, and we're going to move us into Simon's report. We're a bit behind schedule, but I don't think anybody can be critical about that, given what we've just heard about and what we've just been discussing. So, Simon, your report.
Yeah, so following that's quite difficult, isn't it, when you get back into the business report part of the agenda. So look, I'm assuming I'm taking the paper as read, recognising the comment from the chair earlier in terms of the delay in the papers coming out. I hope it's relatively self-explanatory, covers a number of areas. The board needs to receive its update on our emergency preparedness resilience response. The ICB is now a Category 1 responder, which is different to where CCGs were previously, and so we're in the process, the ongoing process of going through what that means and where our response and resilience is and how that works through on-call and other aspects of that. That's set out in there. As part of the AGM and annual assessment process, we've received the NHS letter that's attached in the appendices that sets out their review of us for this year, and really clearly this year there isn't a grading or banding or approach in terms of that. Rather, it's a commentary and it's a narrative in terms of the overview. Actually, the letter is worth taking the time, the appendix is worth taking the time to go through because it sets out a number of areas. I think the positive piece would be when you go through that letter, the areas where they're saying, can you bring some focus to, and we need to do more, I think we'd all recognise being in the work plan. So I don't think there was anything in there that we looked at and thought we weren't cited on that or we were uncertain in terms of that. So that letter's included, and important that we demonstrate that publicly. GP patient satisfaction survey results have now been published. The paper sets out the high-level analysis of that. I would just not want to understate the work that then is going on behind the scenes working on this. The variation is not where we would want it to be, and the focus in terms of that from a Telford and Wrekin perspective is really stark when we look at this, but let's also recognise the work that's going on both from general practice and from the primary care team working on this as part of the GP access recovery piece. There's another set of plans and submissions around that. The plans and submissions are important. It's the change on the ground that's happening there, but equally the demand and the expectations in terms of general practice remains much higher than it was pre-COVID, but the paper sets out where we're up to in terms of that. Winter planning and the progress that we're going through there, both in terms of coordinating an assessment from an NHS perspective, but also from the National Discharge Task Force in terms of the visits that we've had, is summarised in there. Our proposal, Chair, board colleagues, would be that actually in the development session in October that we bring something significantly more detailed. So we're picking up MSK and do that, but that we bring a more detailed conversation around the winter plan the mitigations, what that looks like and where that gets us to, so that the board have an opportunity to talk about that and we socialise that in the right way. We've had the latest Q1 system review meeting, and the headlines from that are set out in there. It's absolutely appropriate, and you touched on it right at the start, in terms of our response to the verdict in the Letby trial. Important that we just recognise and state that, you know, the impact on families and colleagues is absolutely appalling, and we note that, but it's about the response that we deliver in terms of that. So there is absolutely a focus in terms of patient safety and the patient safety data, but as important our response in terms of freedom to speak up. At this point, just on the freedom to speak up piece, I wondered whether it would be appropriate, Chair, just to ask Meredith to comment on that, given the work we're trying to do in this area and the development they're trying to do in this area.
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, just briefly, the ICB has had in place an arrangement which I would describe as provisional over the last year for Freedom to Speak Up Guardian for the ICB. At the same time, all the providers in the system have their own Freedom to Speak Up arrangements in place, all operating in a robust and concentrated way. Letby made us think again, and also guidance came out last year that made us realise we needed to do something extra. So the ICB is going to be establishing a new role, a Freedom to Speak Up Guardian role, which is more a substantive role. We're looking into the possibility of that role being shared with other ICBs. Nothing finalised yet, but that looks like a possible route forward. But I think the more important part is the way that the system, we have a system-wide Freedom to Speak Up arrangement in place. So we're putting in place all the Freedom to Speak Up Guardians across the system to come together on a regular basis. We haven't decided how frequent, but certainly regular, possibly once a quarter, to meet, to discuss learning, the issues and themes that are coming out of the Freedom to Speak Up arrangement, commonalities of problems that guardians might be experiencing, and to make sure that there aren't any gaps in the whole system, so that what might not be happening in one organisation is being picked up in another one, and so forth. So just to have that kind of extra security net, I think, around the whole Freedom to Speak Up arrangement. So I am convening that meeting, and it's going to be picking up pretty soon. And I think it's a really positive and powerful extra element to our security around this area. At the same time, though, we're very keen that people know about freedom to speak up, that they feel safe to speak up, and that they are heard, and that it is followed up. Speaking up is only, if you like, the tip of the iceberg. What happens as a result is the key measure, and that's the area that we're really going to be focusing on with all of our leaders in the system. Simon, thank you.
Thanks, Meredith. If I could just finish on this, and then I know Lynn wants to come in. So on the freedom to speak up piece, the other piece that we've done is, so the ICB's got dual responsibility here, our own freedom to speak up guardian for our own staff, as well as then the system responsibility that Meredith really well articulated. And then equally, we've worked to get 2 freedom to speak up guardians in place in general practice, one in Shropshire, one in Telford and Wrekin, but they're working opposite each other, if that makes sense, so that actually the Telford one is working with the Shropshire practices, the Shropshire practice is working with the Telford and Wrekin practices, so that general practice equally has that freedom to speak up. They're too small on their own for each practice to have a freedom to speak up guardian for that to be effective, but actually by the practices working on a footprint and then doing that cross-cover piece, we believe that's a really sensible way to bring general practice into that space, and I don't think that's in place in many places across the country necessarily, so I think that's a positive step as well. So there's a number of responses that we're putting in place there around this. And then finally, sorry, Meredith.
I should have mentioned on top of that, that we'll be looking at arrangements for pharmacy, optometry and dentistry as well.
Thank you for that. I should have included that, Meredith. Apologies. And then finally is the response to the fit and proper person test and the update on that from NHS England. And we set out in the paper how we will be putting, what are we already doing to put that in place, and how we will ensure that roles that are responsible and accountable in terms of the fit and proper person test will now go through those full checks. I will just highlight to colleagues that they are extensive and they take a significant amount of time, and so the onboarding piece that goes with this going forward, we need to build into any recruitment process because it is significantly more challenging than it was previously, and we can understand the reasons why, but we've got to work through that to make sure that we're robust in that and we understand the time that's going to take.
Okay, thank you, Simon. There's an awful lot in that report. Lynn, you're first in.
Thank you. Just regarding the freedom to speak up piece, really. So Health Watch have been around for 10 years now, and over that time, people working across this system have contacted us because they felt confident that because of our independence, they could share their experiences safely. And we've always referred them back into their own whistleblowing procedures and things like that. But we've added a page to the Health Watch Shropshire website for staff where we've tried to include information about the relevant freedom to speak up channels for them. So I'd really welcome a conversation with the People Directorate to check that that information is still correct and that it continues to be right. My concern is, and maybe there's something that I'm not aware of, but I feel that there needs to be some support for people, particularly working for domiciliary care agencies, who I don't believe have access to freedom to speak up, and potentially people working in care homes as well, because as soon as they've experienced a poor experience, they're very likely to leave this system. And stop working in those sectors at a time when we need them more than ever. And so I do think there is a gap at the moment. And I hope that I'm wrong in that, but if I'm not wrong, then I hope that locally we'll be able to do something about it.
So I think there's a couple of responses to that, Chair. So firstly, absolutely we need to check on the accuracy of the information. I think that's a governance piece. Let's just get that bit right. The second bit, I think it was going to take a bit more work, for the simple reason that the Freedom to Speak Up Guardian piece in terms of the NHS is about those directly employed in the NHS and the governances around that. Domiciliary care, care home, residential homes, your point is really well made, Lynn, and we just need to think about how we make that, do that in a sensible way that adds value because we want their views, but the freedom to speak up bit links to the statutory guidance that's in place. So that's going to take a bit of working through, I think, to get that to the right place.
Thank you. Interesting comments about the local authority dimension and care homes. Did you want to comment on that? Or do you have another point?
I've got another point. But
yep, please.
I think it's a really good question. I will ask now and certainly look at how we can ensure that process is there, especially after we've seen the presentation today, which will actually screams out for exactly what you're saying, I think.
Thank you.
Good. The other point, 2 points I want to pick up, Simon, please. First one is the GP satisfaction survey. Obviously, you've already highlighted that there's a concern, and we do need to look at, and we need to talk about what we're going to do about that as well as a partnership, I think, and also we haven't got to the recovery plans process yet. I know it's going to be November. I think we were told it was coming back in November. But we haven't seen these recovery plans yet locally as part of the partnership, and it's just how we can work together on ensuring that's happening. And my final point is on another issue, the letter from the NHS. It mentions that the HTP is going to be the outline business plan is scheduled to be reviewed in Q2. Just wondering what that means. I don't understand that one, and just wanted to understand it a bit better.
Okay. On the first bit, in terms of general practice, I'm going to look across to Ian and Gareth, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think. Sorry, a bit too long.
I think the loudest microphone.
Yeah. I think it is quite interesting that there is a clear discrepancy or a difference between the outcomes between the two places, Shropshire and Telford, particularly central Shrewsbury. I think since CQC came in, this has been an important part of the CQC inspection. And throughout time, there has been some analysis into this already. So there has been an analysis done by the Health Foundation just last year, published last year, and it has two key observations that I think is pertinent to the system. First one is that in the survey in 2021, it demonstrated that more deprived areas are more likely to report a poor overall experience and less likely to report that their needs have been met. That's the first point. Second one, between 2015 and 2021, practices serving the most deprived areas received the lowest overall patient satisfaction score, while practice in the most affluent areas received the highest satisfaction. So, and this paper specifically focused on the inverse care law. I think that's a phenomenon that's been recognised since 1971. And I think that's very pertinent here. And I believe the difference between the two places is partly reflective of these observations, which coincides with the outcomes of our joint strategic needs assessment, where Telford has a significant higher inequality gap and poor health outcomes compared to Shrewsbury and Shropshire. So perhaps this is something that needs to be recognised by the board and the system, and also by our public health colleagues, and see how we can work together and address that. But the deprivation piece is probably not just the health element, but also about how we tackle things like poverty. I think that's something really important that we need to focus on. It's not just about health, not just about general practice, but a reflection of the system itself.
And we need to get into these issues when we're thinking about a recovery plan when it comes back here. And the point that you made, Paul, is really important about the dialogue that takes place between now and then, so that it's not just something that comes cold to the board in November or whenever it is.
So can we pick up with that?
I think you're dead right. That a place-based approach is the answer to that. It's not a system-based approach.
Yeah,
it's got to be about what's happening in those neighbourhoods and even smaller areas. Maybe practices are maybe not the best way to look at it. Is looking at it on a much more place-based approach.
But the principle and the action actually to pick up a bit about the socialisation of the plans before it comes back in November, and those conversations in those local area conversations to say what's included, what does it mean, and how do we understand that. I think they'll pick up as an action.
Yeah, Dr. Chandler and I were also at the joint HOSC and walked through, actually other colleagues in the room were there at the same time, walked through our intention to work with the councils and local authorities and the partners on the development and sharing of those.
Now, there's a number of other people who want to come in. Tina raised her hand a few minutes ago. Did you want to come in and make your point? But sorry, before I do that, Nitty, you also wanted to come in. Was it on this point about GP access?
Yes.
Do you want to make your point, then Tina will come back to you?
Yeah, so this was just to pick up your point. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Sorry, I'm Councillor Paul Watling, I'm the lead member.
Lovely to meet you, Councillor. Just to say, I chair the Primary Care Committee, so this report came to us as well. I am a practicing GP, not in your area, but somewhere else. Just quickly, your point is very well taken, and I was about to say the same. This is about place-based care and what we should be doing with networks and where investments ought to go in for the future. So the co-creation of a plan is absolutely essential with the council, and that's exactly what we should be doing. So my point, Neil, is that I think we should be having, as we prepare that recovery plan, the discussion with the council is going to be paramount. And I think you've raised that, Ian, in terms of deprivation. I've been hearing this for the last 100 years. I've been a doctor very long. I'm a very old lady. I've been hearing this for a very, very long time. I think really starting to get at it in a proper, meaningful way in how we co-create some of the solutions is probably going to be the key to implementation.
Thank you, and I promise you, Tina, I am going to come to you, but I think maybe Simon, did you want to comment on this particular issue?
It was going back to the freedom to speak up and
domiciliary
care workers. So
do you mind if we just wait for that? I thought, Simon, you raised your hand. Did you want to comment on the primary care access issue? I thought you
do
might.
Indeed, yes, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, might. I thought you might.
Yes, indeed. I mean, obviously, as Healthwatch Telford and Wrekin, we are quite concerned with what came out in the GP annual assessment and the difference between Shropshire and Telford and Wrekin and why the PCNs are so varied in their scoring. We'd be foolish not to, because this is our bread and butter. So a plea that we can be both health watchers
Yeah.
of the work that is ongoing in the background to look at primary care and the recovery plan, because I think we'll both have a wealth of information with which to feed into that. As just an anecdotal point, we're currently running a survey in response to that, asking people about their access to GP care. We've had over 1,000 responses so far, so this does matter to people in Telford and Wrekin. And whilst I appreciate the academic side that people in a deprived area may judge the services they receive more harshly, I think we need to be very careful as a public board meeting about the message that people of Telford and Wrekin might receive, to be told that because you live in a deprived area, you're going to score services worse than if you came from an affluent area. I think that is a dangerous, with respect, Dr. Chan, it's good to know that and to actually ask questions of that when we do the analysis. But we just need to be mindful as a board, or sorry, not the board, I'm here as an observer, you're the board, how we frame that.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point, and I don't think Ian was trying to cast any aspersions whatsoever on that population group. It's simply referencing that there are particular challenges with that kind of population that we need to think about and respond to as part of our recovery plan and how we provide general practice in and around. Ian, have I spoken for you, or there's something else you want to say?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think the key point what I'm trying to say is highlight the issue about poverty, about the inequalities. That's something we need to address. We often talk about this inequality and this poverty within the system, but what initiative has been there in place now and before that specifically dealt with poverty alleviation? Now that's something it's probably something that's I've not heard recently about, but I think this is certainly something as a system, not just health and social care, but as a system, how we can address poverty. I think that's going to be key moving forward. So the academic side is just to give us a bit of indication of why this is happening. It's not just about reflection of access to GPs, but the underlying reason that we need to address it. But this is because prevention is just as important as any intervention.
Really important points coming out and illustrating amply the necessity, Gareth, Nick, of something being co-produced, a real dialogue between now and coming back to the board about what we're going to do to improve primary care access. This bit of discussion has just amply demonstrated that imperative, really. And sorry, I know others want to come in, but your chair's been waiting.
I know.
So,
It's only a very quick point. I think Simon makes a really important point in the part of the paper under culture change, where he says he's demonstrated a culture of doing with rather than doing to, and I think that's something as a board we should endorse collectively.
Absolutely, and didn't we hear that in spades with Luke's story as well? Yeah, there's one. This is a good discussion, and I don't want to discourage questions and comments. I want to come back to the question about the speaking up guardianship in a moment. But was your comment relating to this? Your question relating to this?
Yeah, it was. Yes. Just very quickly. Obviously, just mentioned then about co-designing or working together. I think it might be useful to include the voluntary sector in that, particularly as the people the voluntary sector tends to work with are from those deprived areas and really need that support, which is why we're there, and we build a lot of trust and able to probably get a lot of insight involved in that.
So the message is loud and clear, and I know Gareth and Nick will be taking this very seriously. We really want to be able to see evidence of serious depth of engagement as we respond to this survey. And it sounds like we'll have additional material from the Telford and Wrekin Health Watch survey, amongst other things that we will want to take into account as well. Forgive me, Patricia, did you want to...
Just on primary care, I think it's worthy of a sort of an ICB development session. I know there's a huge amount going on in terms of the primary care committee that Nitty and others chair around detail, some of the operational detail behind this. But I think that the one thing that this discussion, what's fallen out of this discussion, is that GP access or access to your GP or getting an appointment is the tip of the iceberg. There's an awful lot more stuff that needs to be done underneath it in terms of how do you identify your at-risk patients, because most of your at-risk patients aren't the ones that are going to pick up the phone and contact their GPs, and often what's driving the access issue are other people that are very informed that are trying to get their GP appointment. So there's something there about how we organise care better collectively together that then releases time to deal with that issue.
Yeah.
But we also know that the primary care access has a huge impact. It has a particular impact immediately on John and Katrina's services, because if you can't get a GP appointment, people gravitate towards the front end of A&E. But it also has an impact on our services too. So there's we've got to crack this in a different way and in a collective way. And I know that there's loads of good stuff going on in the primary care commissioning committee work, but I think collectively we need to have
I think it's a really helpful suggestion. Let's just agree we'll do that. It's a question of scheduling it.
Yeah, there's just a bit of a balancing point I may make if possible, Chair, for about 30 seconds.
You've got 10.
I think it's just what I'm very conscious of is it not becoming a truism that primary care is failing. We've got a thriving, really healthy primary care service where the activity levels are significantly higher now than they were before COVID. Multiple access points into our GP services, so we can definitely do more. There are practices which are challenged. There are equally practices which are providing really good care and good access, and we mustn't forget those. So it's just a plea that we don't have this as the perception of all primary care practice.
Okay. I don't think it's about failure. I think it's about we can organise ourselves better to support primary care and the wider system. It's about that support, isn't it, really?
So, I'm going to hand back to Simon in a moment to just draw his report to a conclusion, but there was a question about speaking up and guardianship, etc. Did you want to comment on that?
More an offer of help than a question. I just wanted to take opportunity to talk about the work that we've been doing with Shropshire Council on ethical recruitment of skilled workers on skilled worker visas within domiciliary care, because we've had a number of issues with poor treatment of people because of their immigration status and their vulnerability, not wanting to speak up where there has been poor practice within care homes and looked after children. So we've been putting a package together of support, because these workers have no recourse to public funds and don't want to speak up because they don't want to lose their job, they don't want to lose their housing and then be sent home. So we've been working on that, and it's a piece of progress, but actually to build onto that, because there is no channel or guardianship for speaking up, that we can kind of report back to the ICB on the work that's been done there and share the package of support, and then build on that piece of work, to kind of talk about that area where domiciliary care isn't part of this. Well, it's part of the system that we see. So it's an offer of help. That happy to report back.
Thank you very much
that.
indeed. I guess Meredith, amongst others, will have noted that very carefully. Thank you. Simon, back to you. Draw this to a conclusion, and
So a number of actions. Don't intend to go through those, but we'll capture those in the minutes. A really helpful conversation, and also sets a work plan on a number of these areas going forward, which is great. Always the intention of Chief Exec's report is to bring some of this to life and to trigger those discussions, conversations. Final point from me would be we shouldn't need something like the verdict in the Letby trial to be a reminder to board members of our collective responsibility, but I don't want to miss the opportunity to reinforce that if you look at how those discussions are playing out and how they've played out previously, where there's been quality issues, and that's played out through board conversations and future public inquiries, each and every one of us as a board member sitting around this table has a responsibility to make sure that we've provided the scrutiny, the challenge, the insight, the work in terms of the preparedness of understanding the data, understanding the papers and going through that in detail, so that then, and I know you referred to the minutes as Hansard-like, but actually the accuracy of those minutes against the scrutiny of us as board members is what then plays out in a future inquiry or in a future discussion that would be the protection around that, but it's a collective board responsibility in terms of that space. He says, I'm making sure that that will be minuted.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon. And just finally, Paul, you raised a question about HTP, which I realise we haven't answered.
I was going to update Paul after.
Well, what I was going to suggest, actually, please, of course, feel free to do that. It would be worth the board just getting a brief update of progress and timeline as we move forward with the development of the FBC, the full business, or is it the full or final business?
So I don't, rather than trying to do a bit now, so Katrina updates the report, but with Matt, why don't we agree a briefing note that will come round subsequent to the board meeting to all board members that will say here's where it's up to.
Okay with that, Katrina?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just wondering if, I mean, it's going to be news at the moment, so get the timing right so that we're actually sending this when we've got some.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you very much indeed. Now, we're behind schedule, but I promise you we will catch up. And anybody who is travelling home with Agnes, the storm that's due, I meant the storm, Agnes, Storm Agnes. We'll try.
Stacey, I had the same response when he said that to me.
Most of you might not be travelling home with Agnes, but I might be. So.
We'll get there quick. And I asked, have you told Wendy?
She's my wife. This is getting far too complicated, isn't it? Let's move on. The ICS digital strategy. Delighted to introduce to you Dr. Masood Ahmed, who is our CIO, Chief Information Officer and Deputy Medical Director. He has been overseeing the development of the strategy. Masood, over to you.
Thank you. So really, I'll take the paper as read and just give you an overview of the contents so that hopefully I can then engage in some comment and discussion and answer any questions that you may have. Certainly from everything I've heard, a number of the key points that have been discussed in terms of collaboration, in terms of care closer to home, in terms of the place agenda, in terms of engagement and involvement, all of those play into this idea of around transformation. And I do believe that our digital strategy will be instrumental in us actually delivering whatever our ambition is. So really it depends on how bold we are and really how much of a commitment we can make. In terms of the forward, I'm pleased to say that both our chair, our chief exec and our chief medical officer have articulated their commitment to the digital agenda. I think it's recognised that actually we are as a system a little bit behind, yet that also gives us an advantage in the sense that we've got a relatively blank sheet in terms of developing our services and what we do in the future. The focus really, though, isn't about the technology. It is about our people, it is about our communities. And I think often when we talk about digital, we can lose sight of what matters in terms of that transformation journey. I've wanted us to be transparent and honest in terms of our starting point. And so in terms of the actual strategy, I have recognised that we're not in a great place. We're in segment 4 in terms of the National Oversight Framework. We do have a significant deficit. We have challenges around our workforce, whether that be recruitment, retention, whether that be the development of our people. And we also have a slightly unusual or different, shall I say, geography and demographics. We've got an ageing population and we have significant rurality. I remember when I came to the system and sort of started talking about connectivity and 5G, and actually that's exactly the response I got. 5G, gosh, we'd be lucky if we were getting 3G. And quickly I kind of recognized that, okay, we have a low base to start from. And I think when we talk about sort of collaboration and how we work together, it's important that we recognize where our starting point is. And our starting point is our citizens and our patients, but not just our patients, but our carers. The number of, if you like, assets that we have within our communities. And certainly the way in which I have structured the strategy is to ensure that we can all agree that this is what we're working towards in terms of transformation. And so the following few slides are really about segmenting the needs of those within our system. The first is around our citizens and our patients, and really the journey that we hope to follow in the next few years. The following is around our workforce. Again, we have to ensure that we give our workforce the right tools and the right skills so that they can actually utilize any transformational journey that we are on and make the most of that. And then also approaching it from an organizational perspective, because ultimately we work within a system, within various provider systems, provider organizations, and we want to break down those silos. And if we're to do that, then we have to recognize that actually we have to look at the nuance of what each organization wants to do and how do we bring that together so that we work collaboratively. In terms of the thinking behind what we're doing, this is simply a slide that, sorry, I'm changing it on my laptop and not here. But if you've seen it and read it, you know what I'm talking about. In terms of our approach, I think it's important to recognize that there is a lot of information out there. Certainly from the NHS perspective, we have a lot of guidance, we have a lot of frameworks. And so it's ensuring that this strategy is grounded in the research, the thinking, the policy that we have. We've talked about the Hewitt Review, we've got the Fuller Review, the Fuller Stocktake, which looked at primary care. We've also got a number of frameworks, such as what good looks like. So we have a lot of guidance. I'm pleased to say that in terms of shaping this strategy, I did have the opportunity to actually share it overseas. And I was on a trip to Brazil a couple of months ago. And it landed very well. So well that actually the Ministry of Health have invited me back to share our strategy. So I'm hoping the board will approve it.
Is that how to implement 3G?
It may be a bit embarrassing if you don't. But what was interesting is that what's interesting is that the Brazilian healthcare system is actually the largest public healthcare system in the world, and they have based it on the NHS. And so when I went there, they were very interested to learn how we plan to do things and what our thinking is. So I'm very honoured and humbled to be invited back to share what we're doing in Shropshire. In terms of any strategy, it needs to be aligned. And certainly what we can't do is think about digital in isolation. So there is that alignment in terms of our joint forward plan, in terms of our clinical strategy, because ultimately we need to deliver better outcomes. And so this just reinforces the idea. This is going to be a very public-facing document. And so we want to ensure that our citizens appreciate the thinking that's gone into this. And then appreciating that digital is the enabler. I think what we've done within this document is to actually make a number of pledges. And some of them are not particularly the kind of the bells and whistles that you might expect. We have tackled some of the more pressing issues that underpin some of the challenges we've had. So while on the top line we've talked about reducing digital exclusion and being inclusive by design and having that meaningful engagement with our communities, we've also talked about how we might change the model in terms of how we deliver digital and that shared kind of service delivery model, so that as providers we can share the resource and the expertise we have. But I've also focused on compliance and the regulations so that we can be assured that we're doing things in the right way, especially as we move into an age where data is flowing more freely. And so safety came up earlier, security of our data, how it's used, how it's collected. And so there is an emphasis in terms of cybersecurity and what we're doing to protect as guardians of that data. But also in terms of our investments, procurement is a significant challenge. Historically, our provider organizations have procured and made large investments, but we haven't necessarily aligned what we do. And I think we need to recognize that as an opportunity so that we start to align our investments at more of a, rather than a local level, but at a system level. What will be realistic in the next few years? Well, underpinning this, there is a lot of work that's gone into a costed plan in terms of looking at our digital portfolio, understanding where we will have our focus for investment and implementation, but also recognizing that everything we hope to do, we may not be able to do, whether that be from a financial perspective or a capability and capacity perspective. But these are some of the areas that I think are realistic for us to focus on. In terms of that journey, this is simply reflecting the national policy and the move to digitize, connect and transform. And within each of these pillars of activity, there will be the local activity that fits in. And then really ultimately, if we're to operate as a system and be collaborative, it's recognizing that digital could be that thread that kind of, if you like, binds us together in a more productive manner. And then I've touched upon some of the key elements that will make a change. As I said before, it's not really the technology that will make the difference. It's about how we establish the right culture, how we are more of a learning system, where we can share what we do, where we can encourage innovation. I think we need to learn and converge as an ICS. We need to understand that actually we will have significant foundational elements such as our EPRs and the shared care record. How will we utilize those in order to be effective? I've touched upon procurement and how we streamline that so we can make more informed choices in terms of our investments. And our workforce and communities, when we talk about digital literacy, it's not just within our communities. We know that there are significant challenges around ensuring that we have the right skills, but that's not just within our citizens, it's also within our workforce. And then we need to be inclusive. We need to ensure that actually the decisions we make are not from a position where we don't truly work with our communities and understand what their needs are. My belief is that with any transformation journey, especially digital, it should be community owned, it should be clinically led, it should be management enabled, and it should be industry supported. And I think if we take that into account, then I think we're on the right path. And finally, I think if we're going to embrace digital in a meaningful way, we do have to think about the governance. We have to have a very clear operating model in terms of how we will deliver this. We know what we want to deliver, we know the direction of travel, but we need an operating model that will allow us to do that within the kind of, with the restrictions that we have. We need clear decision making. And so ultimately understanding how we will make these decisions in the right way so that the board is assured that we're taking the right steps. And I believe we need to start building the internal capability and capacity within the organisation. I'm going to stop there and welcome any comments or any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Masood. I made an error in that I should have asked Nick to introduce you and the paper, for which I apologise. So I'm going to try and retrofit that slightly, Nick, and invite you to comment.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. This is a really important piece of work. We talk about enabling what we want to do and visions and transforming the service and all the issues we talked about earlier about inequalities and tackling them. Unless we're a completely digitally enabled health and care system, we're going to struggle to do that. We are behind where other ICSs are around the country. That does put us in a difficult position, but as Masood said, it's also an opportunity to think about where we want to be in 5 years' time and aim for that point.
Thank you very much indeed. I know one or two others want to come in. I think Lynn might have been first, and then Nitty and Dave and Claire. Everybody and Trevor. Let's start first of all with Nitty, if I may.
Hi, Nick and I had this chat, and Masood, I deliberately sat next to you. I know Masood really well from a long time ago. So please don't take my comments as criticism. This is just I know we are far behind, but I think we do have to define our ambition around this rather than business as usual. And I know that money in the system is not great, and that we've got to look at practical ways of doing this. But till we define our ambition around digital, I don't think we'll strive to it. We'll end up doing business as usual, back-end automation, back-end, getting EPR systems in place and interoperability in place, which is absolutely essential, don't get me wrong. We're kind of miles behind even low and middle income countries on that, by the way. I work across the world and we're miles behind. But really defining ambition around digital is just much more than that. It's about all the stuff we talked about around place. How do you define, who's ill, how much you put in there, how you invest your budget is all going to be dependent on a whole bunch of stuff around that. Are we going to talk about point-of-care testing diagnostics? Are we going to talk about AI-led diagnostics? Are we going to talk about the lack of workforce being supplemented by digital? So I think there's a whole bunch of stuff around here that we really do need to put into the strategy. And we need to get that right as an ambitious strategy to start off with. I know the money is tight, but we still have to do that.
Thank you. I'm going to take some other comments before asking you, Masood, if you want to respond. Let's take Lynn next.
Thank you. A couple of things from me. As a professional and as someone who's read the NHS long-term plan, I completely get the move towards digital, and I think for any working person, it makes absolute sense as a way of communicating and understanding the care that you're receiving. But I really do appreciate in your slides where you've quoted that it should be digital first, but not digital only. And I think there has to be an acceptance that it will never be the case that everyone in Shropshire, Telford and Wrekin uses digital as a way of accessing their care and other services. Because I'm also a carer of 2 elderly parents with dementia. And every time there's a crisis, I'm very conscious that the only way I can know who to call is if I go on the internet and find it. So I think as a system, we also need to find other ways of communicating with people effectively. Because without me and without my ability to go online, which I can't do in their house, but I can do on their drive, I would not get anywhere, and they can't get anywhere because they have no idea where to start, which is why loads of people phone 111 inappropriately, I imagine, and phone 999 when they don't need to. So I do think that there's something to be done about how that information is given that is not digitally exclusive.
Thank you. Dave, would you like to come in next?
Yeah, sure. Don't know this. Oh, you want this. So I think this is really useful in terms of setting out, but my concern is it's difficult to say it's a strategy. It's a set of intent. This is our intent. I think for me, in terms of moving forward, to actually sign this off as a strategy, you would have to then review. First of all, is this implementable? We need to talk about our starting point. I know from another system I'm involved with that we have huge incompatibilities of different architectural approaches between the systems. We also have huge cultural issues from provider to provider in terms of where they want to go, in terms of their focus on digital. And I think we've got to recognise that we are in a capital constrained world. And where does this fit in terms of a priority against all the other priorities we've got for capital? So I think in terms of is this a laudable intent, then absolutely fine, absolutely sign it off. But I don't think we can sign this off today as a strategy, because this says in 3 years' time we will do all this, but we don't know whether we will or not, because we don't know whether there are other competing demands that are equally valid. And so I think to actually roll this into a integrated capital prioritisation programme would make sense, and then to assess where it stands in that, rather than try to sign it off as a standalone. Because if we sign this off as a standalone, we sort of should be committed to it, and it will have major problems, I think, passing muster in terms of an integrated capital plan. And I think those are the sort of things that we need to consider in the round.
Thank you, Dave. Really helpful comments. I'm still gathering views.
To that, if I may.
Yeah, please. Claire, feel free.
So yeah, very similar comment really to what Dave has just said. Interestingly, digital is one of the areas where there is some capital floating around at the moment. The constraint that we've got is actually in the revenue consequence of that capital. We can't afford to maintain the ongoing costs for the money that nationally we're being offered. And I know we've been in really challenging positions over the last few years even, where we've had to say no to investment because we physically cannot afford it. And I think that's the root of one of the issues that we've got as a system, that for many years our financial constraints have meant that this has been an area that's not been invested in as sufficiently as it should. I think linking to your point about the operating model, Masood, I have a plea really. We need to be able to scope, even as an estimate, what we think the impact, the revenue impact is of these things that we want to do, because quite honestly, this is the foundation of a lot of the work that we want to do. It needs to be in that prioritisation process alongside service change and all the other good things that we want to do. And we don't have that at the moment, and I'm really keen to push getting that. I think we've got enough in the strategy document for clarity in terms of that direction of travel. We can work on the broader things, but from a very practical perspective, I need some sense of scale in terms of that prioritisation conversation that we're going to have over the autumn and winter in terms of the plan.
Thank you. I'm still gathering views, and I'll come back to all of these as I attempt to summarise. But I want to bring in Trevor, who raised his hand.
Okay. 100 million over 5 years. That's my starting pitch. But no, I mean, I was fortunate. I had a catch up with Mahood a couple of weeks ago, and I think there isn't anything to argue with in this document. But picking up on Niti and indeed on Lynn, it's sort of one of the advantages of being behind the curve is that actually you've got the potential to actually leap ahead rather than just be catching up. Because if we're not ambitious, then we'll just spend the next 20 years trying to catch up rather than actually do anything productive. I think the other angle on it, though, and I can see why it's been written in this way, this is a good, effectively organisational descriptor. And again, I think Mahood and the team have done a good job with the resources we've got. But actually, if we go back to the conversation around the GP report and the poverty and the sense of the population, if we take more of a population-based approach to this rather than an organisational-based report, that's when you'll start to get the real advances in this and start anticipating those people who are at risk, who can work together, where we can focus funds and everything else. And I suppose that then gives me a question to Andy in part as to, and it would have been David if he'd been here, as to whether there's a political will in Shropshire, Telford and Wrekin to really have a digital presence and an overall strategy that is right through all the communities and linking all of those things together, because that's absolutely critical. My last real provocation for us as a system would be, is this one area where actually we've got to move quickly from collaboration to unification in terms of how we organise it?
Powerful points. And Paul, you wanted to come in, and you might want to comment from a Telford Council perspective, and Andy from a Shropshire perspective. Interesting challenge from Trevor. What do you make of it, and make your own point as well, of course?
Well, I'd want to say, I mean, I welcome the report, well written. What I would say is you miss maybe some of the stuff that we're already doing. If you just look at the Independent Living Centre and how the whole of the partnership is working together in Telford and Wrekin to support people to move to digital care and to digital healthcare as well. I mean, that's working really well. And taking your point of view about the voluntary sector, Richard, the voluntary sector lead on the Independent Living Centre in Telford and Wrekin. And it's a really good example of using a smaller amount of resource to make a bigger change. I think we changed the public's view of how they can use digital, but by then seeing how they can use digital, you know, and that's what's happening in Telford and Wrekin, and I'm really pleased about that. So I would say to your question on whether there's a willingness, I think it's a necessity, not a willingness. I think we need to do it, we've got to do it, and moving towards that is really important. The difficulty is I have to make £3 million worth of savings this year in my budget. So how we do preventative work and innovative work in that way whilst making those savings is really, really difficult.
Let's take a Shropshire view of this piece of territory, Mr. Begley.
So I'm very grateful that you're asking me for the, it was a political will when the leader of the council just stepped out.
Quick, let's not
yes.
We promised
yes is the direct answer to the question. I think if I may, I'm not going to go into the details about some of the front end issues that have been raised, because we understand that, and the work that we're doing around full county connectivity, digital exclusion, all those things that have been well rehearsed. What I really want to talk about is actually some of the potential of this, and thinking about some of the comments that have been made already about how aspirational we really are as a system around this agenda. My concern is that I do think we are late to the party. If I'm being critical of us as a system, I think we're in real danger of kind of using yesterday's thinking to fix yesterday's system, which in a way will give us a system that will be fit for purpose for yesterday. And what we're really not seeing is the opportunity to leapfrog now some of the system architecture, connectivity issues, cultural issues that we're raising here. There is so much we can do in this space in terms of collecting that business intel, but then applying AI and other thinking to that whole breadth of data, seeing that, if I may, from a non-clinical perspective in terms of that much broader population health and well-being agenda, and looking again at those opportunities using proxy indicators of demand, all sorts of good stuff that we can then understand where those opportunities are to intercept, interfere with that predictable demand that we're seeing into services at the moment. If we truly want that left shift, we're going to have to use that broader sense of intel gathering and application. The AI bit, for me, is not just applicable, as you can imagine, to that understanding of demand and future demand, but actually if we apply that internally, then your starting point of 100 million over 5 years, I would say is really minimal when we think about the opportunities to reduce activity, unnecessary activity, by highly paid professionals. We can remove so much of that internally within our systems. If we start to think of that truly collectively as an ICB, as a system, as opposed to individual organisations, we multiply that benefit. I'll stop there. Yes, a bit of a proponent of this, really.
Excellent comments from you all. I just wanted to ask Trevor, oh, sorry, did you want to come in, Katrina?
Thank you. Just to sort of continue the conversation, actually, and hello, Dave. We met a while. I agree that in terms of the strategy element of it, I think there's a lot more we could be thinking about putting into this as a strategy. I'm not seeing the bottom up build within the strategy as well as the top down. That might be the way that I'm reading the document. But the other piece is, for me, is that the requirement for this, or the request for this, is approval. And I would just like to clarify, to seek clarification in approving the document. Will the board also be approving the Chief Digital Information Officer's function? Because that could turn into a significant financial requirement in the early instance. Or will we actually be looking at a bottom-up exploration of how we collectively look at our resources to be addressing some of this? And I do think we need to get the baseline and the foundation robust, and I do think we need to, in parallel, be putting the more innovative stretch on it.
Thank you, Katrina. And I just wanted to ask a question of Trevor, which might play into your comment, Katrina. You mentioned unification. What did you have in mind?
Yeah, that might not have been the right word, but I'm just very conscious in a sort of financially constrained world where we'll never have enough money, we absolutely cannot afford to waste anything. And we can't afford to duplicate anything. And I just think, you know, as I say, unification might be one step too far. But it really is a question around how do we work better to make sure we're not replicating stuff. And you know, those of us who run organisations, we all know we've got some day-to-day IT stuff that we wouldn't want to put into anybody else's hands because it's part of what we are. But we're talking about bigger ambitions here to do bigger things. And I can't help but think that we might need much more coordination around that.
Thank you. Masood, thank you for provoking this discussion. I think we'd all be very happy to note the contents of the report, but I think the messages are also clear that we should see it as a starter for 10, a catalyst for further discussion. The notion of us missing the boat through a lack of ambition should be anathema to us all, and we need to think very carefully about how we pitch our ambition, thinking about the next few years. I think that what we need to do is take the work that you've already done. We need to open up the discussion so that there is much more engagement from people across the board. And maybe there's been a lot of that already, and I'm not aware of that. My experience of this kind of thing in the past is that the digital strategies that have tended to shine best are the ones where there's been really strong clinical and public engagement from the start as it develops. And maybe that's happened, but I think I've heard quite a bit from people that there's probably a case for doing even more of that. And I'd rather we took a little more time with this and develop it into something really exciting, ambitious, but deliverable in a way which Claire Skidmore feels comfortable in terms of its implementation and affordability, than simply nod something through today. I think we're all saying thank you for the work you've done, thank you for provoking our thinking, but there are some next steps that we need to think about carefully. And Nick, Masood and others, we'd look to you to bear that in mind. I think the point about using Trevor's term unification is really important. The notion that quite independently every organisation represented around this table, including local authorities, I venture to suggest, can develop their own strategies, their own implementation plans, is just nonsense, certainly from the NHS perspective. We've really got to think about a system-wide approach, not just with local government, but other sectors around this table as well, to truly develop an integrated digital transformation strategy. That's the way in which we'll make progress in a system which is small, quite frankly. So I'd like to ask, next piece of work, Nick, Masood, sketch out for us some next steps, some actions that you think we should take to develop this thinking further. Great start, great provocation, but let's take it further than we've had it thus far. Is that fair, Nick? Are you happy with that?
Yeah, Chair, if I might be able to respond to some of the points, if that's okay.
We're really running out of time, Masood, if you don't mind.
That's fine, noted.
I think we've probably got a clear enough message from the paper and from the contributions we've made. People are very grateful to you for stimulating the discussion. Let's think about what we do next. Thank you very much indeed, a good discussion. Now, time, as usual, is our worst enemy. Nick, can you deal with the NHSE delegation of specialised commissioning and all of that malarkey fairly swiftly? Then I'm going to suggest we take our comforts break and then reconvene.
Yeah, I'll do this piece. I'm trying to get into 5 minutes, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed.
So on that basis, I'll take the paper as read and I'll just highlight their most salient features. As part of the reorganisation that ICB came into being, the look at how we commission services has changed from an artificial break where we had locally commissioned services and specially commissioned services, which broke along the steps on patient pathways. But it's so important when you commission services, you commission the entire pathway. So as part of that, the specialised commissioned services, and these are normally treatments carried out in tertiary centres, broadly speaking, they're being delegated down individually to ICBs. The whole purpose of this is to make a decision-making far more responsive to the needs of the local population. We're talking about a significant amount of work in terms of money, which is a good indicator of the scale. Simon talked earlier about our £1 billion to spend. The specialised commission services account for approximately 150 million of that. So it's a decent piece of work, and specialised commissioning services does carry risks, financial risks, the cost, performance risk, particularly around access to services. And there's really strong evidence that the further away you live from tertiary services, less likely you are to access those services in a timely fashion. And also the quality risk. It's really complex pieces of work. And majority of the work is actually carried out outside the system. So if we're a purchaser of work from elsewhere. So approximately 64 million of the work is carried out within a system, majority in SAF, and it's mainly cancer activity, cancer surgery, chemotherapy, radiotherapy, and renal therapy. In addition, within Raja, it has its own specialist services, which are orthopaedics, and in particular, it's bone cancer work and its spinal rehabilitation work. But more of this activity is carried out outside the system, particularly in Birmingham and in Stoke-on-Trent, which is approximately £84 million. There's a lot of activity. The first step in the delegation, which is why the paper's here today, is to get approval to sign off a PDAF, and that's a piece around about delegating services. We're not going down to take a work on as a system. We're going to do it as a collaborative piece of work, board and common between the 6 ICBs in the West Midlands. Okay? And so the purpose of this paper is to make you aware of the nature of the work we're talking about, the money involved, and our approach in the first instance as work comes down. It's come down in tranches. There are 178 prescribed services, and initially we're going to take a fraction, approximately a third of those services, 59, we delegated down to ICBs, West Midlands ICBs, acting in common, and that will be delegation process for the development of what's a pre-delegation assessment framework. So as well as the covering paper which I've presented, there's a data pack about the type of activity this actually means for the patients. There's a copy of the PDAF itself, and there's also a briefing note which is prepared by the regional commissioning team for all the ICBs. So the request is to recognise this as direction of travel, and then to proceed with the signing of the PDAF, which is a first step in the process of delegation of specialist services to ICBs or groups of ICBs acting together.
Dave?
The one question that I had was, given that we're potentially going to be operating as a multi-ICB framework in this, what risk do we really have in terms of repatriation and redirection of specialist services?
Okay, so one thing we're quite keen to avoid currently, as in this year, next year going forward, is not about redirections, about access. It's not about services not currently being carried out here being moved back into the system. It's as much about ensuring our patients have access in a timely fashion to the best possible services which are available across the West Midlands footprint.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking particularly around things like cancer, where you've got real issues of scale, and you've got much less patient intolerance to distance. And I know when we're looking at this in Hampshire, a repatriation of services across the Hampshire-Dorset border is a real issue. And even if if you're looking at financial issues from a number of these ICBs, temptation to bring services, say, into Birmingham is going to be high. And I know that it says in there that there's a mechanism not to look at change of flows. But that will clearly come into play, and I'm just wondering how that's going to be managed.
Yeah, that will be managed through the boarding common at the West Midlands level. Everybody's really conscious about balancing off changing in flows and destabilising financially and through activity, some providers currently. But as it stands at the moment, as it gets delegated down for next year, the pathways remain in place, but there's an opportunity for those really sensible conversations about what services do we need going forward, and are they currently being in the right place, and an element of patient choice for some of these services as well.
And I suppose the follow-up from that was, that concerned me was, if we're going to, if these, all the flows are going to be protected and all the systems are going to be, what's the point of doing it? So in other words, it has to, you think if they're going to do something, there has to be some change that could be facilitated.
So this is the first step in that, which is giving the ICBs that act in common the power to start having those conversations. Part of the pack is a list of various groups, which all the ICBs, including this one, represent in various subcommittees. Now there's places where those conversations are going to take place about, in the future, what do we want the structure of these services to look like. But for the purpose of delegating for effectively the next financial year, we're proposing that they keep in place as they are, just so we can provide the kind of services we're currently doing. That makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
It's the first step in the process.
Claire?
Thanks. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say that we shouldn't sign. We have to do this, and I actually support the direction of travel. I think the pathways have been fractured for too long. It wasn't the best of historic decisions, really, to do that. For me, though, as a board, I think we need to be seeking more information on the risks attached with what is coming, so that we can plan and prepare and mitigate them appropriately. And I think some of that will be an ask of colleagues who are in NHS England already providing these services, but actually some of this is about us challenging ourselves about how do we want this to work, how do we want to get the best out of this arrangement. So for me, the two that most directly touch me, I'm bound to mention finance, aren't I? There are some significant financial risks here. So this is around about £150 million that we're spending. At the moment, we're not clear about what allocation we will actually receive. We know there's an overall pot, but how those shares work is still to be agreed. There's a shift nationally in the allocation formula that we're just trying to get our heads around. It's not actually been finalised yet, but we're trying to understand it as best we can for where it's at. So for the last few years, we've had contracts and allocations on a provider basis. That's now changing to population. I think there are some benefits of that from us. I think we've been underfunded on a needs basis, but I want to see the numbers, and I really want to test that to be able to see if how that materialises. We also need to do some work as that collective about the risk share arrangement and what that means for us. I think linked to that is my other point about resource internally, to make the linkages into these conversations, to really pull in that strategic conversation about how do we really maximise the benefit of having this in our control, and also having the voice in that wider group. I don't want us to be the poor relative because we're smaller in terms of population size. It's equally as important for every person, wherever they sit in the Midlands, that we have the best opportunity for them. So I think my ask really from this board is that we potentially take away an action to really map those risks carefully and make sure that we've considered those and all the other ones I'm sure that exist around that, but just using those as examples.
I would agree. Those are the two concerns for me. One is that, having previously been in a role where delegated primary care commissioning came down with a resource that turned out to be Scotch Mist, that we get the people and the resource. And secondly, is that other piece, not necessarily moving tertiary services. You know, if I need a mechanical thrombectomy, I want to be done in Birmingham. Actually, it's about the access to those services. And again, 3.7% of spend on tertiary services is significant for us in terms of our population. Yep. But is Birmingham really going to give a flying fig, given some of their key pressures? That is a huge risk for us in terms of making sure that we have an equal and open voice for our population. Okay. And those are the two things that I think we've got to have documented and are clear about in terms of region and this collaborative as well.
So last comment, query from Tina.
Can I just add one other risk around monitoring of quality? Our quality is going to be monitored, we're going to be responsible.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Thank you, Meredith.
So just very quickly, I think there may be some other ramifications in here that I'm not sure are being picked up. They may be. For example, becoming a commissioner will place public involvement and consultation duties on us, which we need to take into account, just so we know that it's coming our way. I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, only that have we taken into account of all the implications of this move.
Thank you very much indeed. So Nick, how do you want to respond to those comments before I summarise them?
The first bit is around the expertise and the staff and the reference to the primary care coming down. There is a regional specialised commissioning team, which is approximately 40 people, but they're not going to be, one of the reasons taking the committee for the voters, they're not going to be split out. They're all going entirely into the host organisation, which is good if it works.
Yeah, and they don't get sucked into other parts of the system. Yeah.
That, along with the other conversation about making sure every system has a voice in the wider part, in the conversations going on, as we speak, there's a strong structure of subgroups, which is highlighted in all the papers, and those conversations are going. It's really important we have the staff within us as an ICB team to be able to go to all those meetings, interact meaningfully, and have the skills to actually express our views and understand what's going on.
It's one of the risks of being such a small ICS and the periphery of much bigger ICSs. Yep.
Simon.
It sounds as though, Chair, people are saying this is pre-delegation assessment framework, so signing that would be okay because it's pre-delegation, it doesn't commit to a final position, but there's an important supporting letter that goes with it that sets out the nature of the conversation so that we've got an audit trail that goes with that as well. So I would suggest there's two bits, which is, yes, we go forward with the PDAF, but that Nick, on behalf of the board, drafts a supporting letter that puts the challenges in, and that's shared back with the board when that's sent.
That was going to be my suggestion, Simon. I think that's very sensible. So my personal view is this is the right kind of thing to do. This kind of delegation gives us more leverage over the resource and the services that are provided for our population. But it needs to be properly constructed. We need to be absolutely clear about the risks and how they're to be managed. So signing this thing called a PDAF and a letter saying that in principle we support the direction of travel, but there are some caveats, as discussed by the board, is an important next step. So if that's the approach that people are generally happy with, then I suggest that's how we take it forward. Thank you, Nick, very much indeed. I promise not to call this subject a malarkey again. Now, we're way behind schedule. Stacey, are you okay for us to have our break now? I don't know, is Ria joining you?
No.
No, so we don't have to look after her in a sense of waiting longer. Let's take a 10-minute break now and a 10-minute break, and then we'll start again. Everybody,
Yeah, interesting.
we're now moving into. Thank you.
Isn't it nice to see such authority?
I know. Kathy Purd, Patricia Davis, this means you as well. It means Simon Whitehouse to come and take his seat. You might think this is blackcurrant juice, but it's the rum that's in there as well. But,
I've seen the next hour of the agenda.
all right. I'm going to move us on. The ICS People Collaborative. Ria, we thought might be here, but Stacey, the ball is in your court. Over to you.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks, Neil. And just in the spirit of time, this isn't a revised people strategy. You saw some months ago, it was brought here to the board, the system people strategy that was signed off, where there was a lot, a wealth of collaboration input from all across the system, as well as our education partners. But the one thing we've been really struggling is having that ambitious strategy that takes in all the people promise, looking at delivering people services at scale, etc. It is ambitious, and rightly so. Our people deserve us to have ambition when it comes to this agenda. We've had multiple conversations, I'd say, over the last couple of months, really positively actually, with chief execs, HR professionals, etc., around how do we put some focus, refocus, prioritisation, and more importantly, how do we start to deliver some of this? As well, just for information, this paper did go through the ICS People Committee last week, didn't it, Katrina, and was supported. So really the paper, plus the slide deck as well within the appendix pack, looks at how we've reframed the current people strategy and refocused and aligned it really to the long-term workforce plan. Again, from an ownership, to be able to drive some of the delivery of this, we've agreed SROs for each of their work streams. We've done some work around realigning what people resource, not again, which I'll come on to around the risks, but how we've aligned the capacity we've got across the system to their work streams, which is now enabling us to identify where the gaps are, both from a capacity and capability perspective. We've agreed absolutely that this is the perfect work that should be done as a collaborative, as a people collaborative, sort of led, the operational structure around that led both with the ICS Chief People Officer, but also providers as well. Again, we've looked at how we drive delivery through governance. So again, within the slide pack, I believe in the appendices, there's the revised sort of governance around how, as I say, drive delivery, but also oversight. All of this as well, we've looked at the responsibilities, obviously, as providers, but also the statutory role that the ICB also has from a workforce perspective for its people. So again, that's been factored into the work. So I wasn't going to say much more, well, I would have done if we had a bit more time, but that's a very brief summary really of the steps. Just to call out, obviously, from a risk perspective, and there's a piece of work underway at the moment that our HRDs are leading, which is coming back to chief execs in a couple of weeks' time, around the risks around capacity and also the financial risk as well, and how potentially we can deliver that differently. So I think the paper just quantifies the risks, but there is a piece of work currently underway. There's 3, I believe, recommendations in the paper, Neil, but as I say as well, endorsed by the ICS People Committee last week. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Patricia, as a provider CEO, apart from Stacey, of course, what's your view about this? Are you supportive?
Yeah, I mean, we had a chief execs meeting a couple of weeks ago just before the people board where we sort of thrashed out some of the common purpose around the HR provider collaborative, as it were. So I think we've got real kind of clarity around the key areas of focus that we need to be having jointly as providers around workforce and HR. So yeah, I completely endorse and support this.
Thank you very much indeed. Any other comments? Ian?
Yeah, I think in this strategy, in this paper, I'm not too sure where general practice fits in, because if you look what it looks like from 2.2 that the strategy was created in a collaboration with senior decision makers, with all the trusts and other providers, but general practice is missing here.
They were there.
They were there.
They were definitely there.
It wasn't mentioned here. So, yeah, likewise in the appendix.
I didn't
so
want to mention people because I'm bound to forget somebody,
yeah.
but they were definitely
Great.
in the room.
Yeah. It's just that it wasn't there, so I thought, yeah.
I'm sorry, Chair. I think the question's right, Ian, and Stacey's covered some of it. I think the training hub piece and the funding of that, we need to think about how does this start to come together in one place so that we don't have a GP training hub that sits out to one side working in isolation whilst we're trying to do the people agenda here, because your question is right, why is it not all together in one place? So I think there's a piece of work around how we transition that and get that into the right place without losing the bonus and without losing the focus of the training hub that's in place.
Thank you. And Katrina, as there you are, Chair of the People Board, do you have any comments you want to make about this?
We received the paper last week. Unfortunately, the People Committee wasn't quorate from an NHS leadership perspective, but we had a lot of stakeholders around the table, so we have got a very broad perspective on it. The conclusion really is that whilst people are a significant driver of our finances, because a lot of our finances is based on payroll and a lot of our overspend is associated with particularly agency, people are also our biggest opportunity to meet our financial challenges. So I think the People Committee took away the consideration of their role to actually steward or to advocate and to steward part of the overarching people ask, because we are so pivotal both as upside and downside on the conversations. So I think it's we need the shape of it, grand, SROs, grand, realignment with the people promise, fine, and the people strategy that's come out, absolutely fine. But it's also to be able to make sure that people have a really robust voice in the ICB in terms of what overarching workforce requirements are.
Important points. Thank you very much indeed.
Balancing, in a balancing way.
Lynn.
Yeah, just a quick one from me. As someone who's had 2 career changes, I've been a teacher and a social worker, when I came into this system, I thought, how am I going to help with the workforce issue? So I tried to see if any of my training and skills were transferable, and they weren't. And now I've got financial responsibilities and things, and I can't access training because of needing to work. So I just wonder what consideration has been given to those people who would be prepared to career change it to work and support this system, but who can't do it. And you might not have an answer now, but I do think I cannot be the only person in Shropshire who's thinking like that.
That's a really good point, Lynn. We'll take that one away. A lot of focus is going in on our younger sort of apprenticeships, etc. But you're right. There's also something.
But at the last People Committee, we did actually take an action, didn't we, Stacey, to be looking at our. I can't remember the terminology that Graham Guest used, who's the principal of Telford College. But how do we actually support those towards the end of their careers, where they're actually actively deciding to take a lateral move into a different career for however many years of their working life they may have left, whether that be 25 or whatever they're looking at. So it isn't just about the young people. The focus is on the young people, but it most definitely isn't just about the young people, because there's a massive opportunity. The other conversation we had was about just how important our people strategy is in terms of the economic elements of our ICB responsibilities, because we are an anchor organisation. We are one of the, if not the largest employer across the whole of Shropshire, Telford and Wrekin, and therefore by actually ensuring that our own residents are accessing the jobs across the organisations within this board, we are enhancing the economic strength of our communities as well. So, you know, those are the considerations that we're bringing into the mix.
Thank you.
Just in response to that, actually each organisation does have opportunities for people to transition into health through healthcare support worker roles that then get sponsorship to become a nurse, an AHP or whatever. But there's probably something in your question which means that needs to be communicated widely.
But I think there's also something about the level though, because I can't afford to go in as a I live alone,
but
I've got no support.
As we're exploring and bringing forward the apprenticeship routes, which will be growing across many more roles than they currently are established in, and across many different grade levels as well. So, you know, we will be looking at apprentices as a means by which we can build in flexibility too.
Thank you. So, Stacey, what happens next?
So we've got conversations scheduled, chief execs to, I think the risk element, we need to unpack some of that. The work has already commenced with the SROs leading that. Say the governance structure and committees and the groups that sit under that are now in the diary. So it's about starting to deliver on some of this.
And Katrina, you content we've got deliverables quantified, outcomes quantified?
Yeah, we have, but the deliverables and the KPIs are currently structured against the old strategy structure. Shifting the strategy structure now into the train, retain, etc. We're going to have to realign, and that work is underway.
But that's working.
And the other thing we're looking at as well is the intermediate KPIs, because there's a lot about motivation and support for staff if we're actually hitting intermediate KPIs as well as the end goal. So we're going to build in the journey along the path as well, so that's clear too.
That's encouraging. Thank you very much indeed. Unless there are any further points, I suggest we take the report as read, accept the recommendations therein, and look forward to receiving updates, Katrina, Stacey, as things move forward. Thank you very much indeed. So, Integrated Care System Performance Report. Claire Skidmore.
Thank you. So just to flag to board members that this is a continually evolving report. We're now covering all 4 domains in terms of quality, finance, workforce and operational delivery, and that we're continuing to look at examples of good practice and development of how this report works best for us. I will take it as read, but I just wanted to tease out the highlights that are pulled through in the recommendations just to make sure that board members have had opportunity just to consider those. From a finance point of view, at month 5, we are reporting £59 million deficit. That's year to date and is £23 million adverse to plan. Our formal reporting shows a forecast outturn of hitting plan, which is £57 million deficit. However, we know that we have significant unmitigated risk that we're pulling through in our numbers, and as we landed the month 5 position, that was sat at around £82 million, predominantly within SAF and the ICB. It goes without saying that there is a lot of work and a lot of focus and attention on that at the moment, because we have to make sure that we've got robust plans in place to bring that risk down as much as we can before the end of the year. I think I mentioned earlier in the meeting, we had a conversation with Chief Execs, Directors of Finance and Chief Operating Officers this morning, where we agreed a series of actions to really nail down some of the forecasts and projections that we've got, particularly around areas such as escalation, some of our activity assumptions, specifically around ERF, and some of our efficiency and workforce plans. So quite an area of focus at the moment, and we're expecting further conversations with both regional and national colleagues about that position. From an elective point of view, we wanted to flag the improvements in cancer diagnosis and waiting times. We have eliminated 104 and 78-week waits, and I'm told that we're the best performing system in the region for 78-week waits, so I think that's something to be reflected. I know we've got lots of difficult messages to deliver, but we have got some good news stories in there as well. We are part of a tiering system around elective recovery, and I think Julie may have reported in the past that we've been in Tier 1 for that because of some of the challenges that we've got, but we have now been moved to Tier 2 for that elective position. Urgent and emergency care, I mean, it's consistent really. The two biggest issues that we have as a system at the moment, the challenges we've got are around urgent and emergency care and finance. We can see that some of our metrics have deteriorated in July and August, and absolutely we feel that pressure in South on a day-to-day basis, but also through into community beds and some of our other services. We have now got Louise Barnett chairing the Urgent and Emergency Care Board, which I think will really help us get some traction in terms of some of the delivery plans that we've got, and I know that there's some recent work being done in terms of revising our recovery trajectories and really focusing down on the work that we need to do. We still continue to have long waits in adult and children and young people mental health services. I don't think that's a new issue that I'm bringing to the board at this point. And obviously recognising the national issue, we are still taking local action to try and address the longest waiters and most complex patients. Again, Julie said before to the board, there is no additional investment for recovery in non-acute, so mental health community services. So we really do struggle in terms of those targets. And then just to pick up a last couple of highlights from the recommendations. First of all, we are seeing high numbers of mixed sex accommodation breaches. So again, bringing that quality thread through into this report now. And we do have a system risk around C. diff. I think that's understandable in the context of the pressures that we've got in the trust and the high volumes of activity, particularly around the mixed sex accommodation breaches. But there is an action plan in place, and I know that our various forums and committees will be scrutinising that both at an organisational level, but also at system level. And just to finish on a workforce point, we do have a positive message in that in month 5 we have seen a combined positive variance for substantive staff in post against plan. So we are starting to see the product of our recruitment activities, which is something we need to highlight. I think in the report it does flag that pharmacy workforce is one of the areas that we are concerned about because those numbers are dropping. So again, in its entirety, it's a good news story, but we still need to keep an eye on certain pockets of potential risk areas. I think for me, the proof of sustained impact of that will then be on setting that view of the substantive whole-time equivalents against our view of bank and agency costs as well. So a bit of a theme that's popped up a few times in discussion through board and earlier discussions is about how we get the right balance of staff in the position and try and reduce the premium costs that we've got of interim staff as we build that substantive staffing base. Happy to pick up any comments or questions.
There's an awful lot there. So let's begin to unpack it. Dave.
Okay, there are a number of things, but the one thing I really just couldn't get my mind around was why our performance on elective recovery was so poor when we're overstaffed, we've got staff over plan, we've got very high agency spends, and we've got capacity available. So I couldn't square why we weren't doing better on elective recovery.
Sorry. Hi Dave, I'm Gareth. I'm the Director of Delivery and Transformation. I might have misunderstood your question. Did you ask why we're not performing well on the elective recovery?
Yeah.
So I think in many ways the data is demonstrating that the performance on the elective side and 78 weeks and 104 weeks and 65 is actually really quite positive. We're ahead of plan, and as Claire described, we're outperforming other systems within the region as a whole. And that's a significant turnaround from where we were this time last year, and I think real credit to all the organisations, all three providers that are contributing to that. We are continuing to struggle with the cancer performance, but again, on the two key measures of the faster diagnosis and the 62-day standard, we are ahead of plan on that. It's still not good enough in terms of what we expect for our patients against the national standard, but we've got a recovery plan that is broadly on track, and in fact slightly ahead of plan. I don't know if John or Katrina wanted to add to that, particularly in the cancer side.
Yeah, I'm interested in and it is a perception about capacity. One of the issues that we actually do have as a region is that we have got lower levels of capacity than the actual demand. So one of the reasons why we're doing well in part of the elective recovery is we've got a lot of insourcing coming in. So we're doing a lot of work within our own resources, but then we've also got in-sourced resources who are topping up the plan as well. The other thing is that if you actually look at our bed capacity, the bed capacity reports at approximately 90%, which suggests we've got empty beds. But the way that the beds are captured is because that number, for example, includes the paediatric beds. And invariably, the paediatric beds empty out to a significant degree at night, and it's captured at midnight. That has a significant effect on the percentage. The other thing is that in terms of some of our surgical beds, we are being rigorous about ring fencing, particularly our inpatient surgical beds, which means that we will not, as best as we possibly can, we will not put emergency patients in to the surgical beds that are potentially ready for patients the next morning to come into after their operations. So there's elements of ring fencing, there's elements of the way that the data are collected, and there are also elements of, in terms of our diagnostic capacity and in terms of some of our surgical capacity, we've got a lot of insourcing as well, which suggests capacity, inherent capacity is lower than demand.
But I just wanted to pick up on, so elective recovery, if you're measuring in terms of number of patients waiting beyond a certain time, that seems oddly okay. But in terms of ERF performance, the numbers are showing very, very, very low performance. And I mean, I don't know whether the numbers are right or not, but they are showing, what they're down at sort of 80% of activity versus 1920, which is the ERF measurement.
We're just doing some work on ERF at the moment to triangulate all of that, and without getting into too much of the technicalities here, there's a lot of that that's driven by the fact that ERF is calculated on value-weighted activity.
Yep.
So depending on what activity you're pushing through, it skews the percentages. So if you plan on heavily value-weighted activity, but you actually drive through the lower-weighted activity, it's skewing the ERF. So that's something we're looking at the moment.
It's still very, very low.
And industrial action just wipes out our ability to...
Industrial action certainly played a part of it. But we are actually delivering more elective activity in totality than was according to our original plan. But again, it's much easier to ring fence the day case, so a lot of day case surgery is being done. We're more limited in being able to ring fence the big surgery. And we're focusing a lot on the cancer and the P2s, P1, P2s for those. And again, it does influence the weighted elements that Claire's referenced.
Yeah, I'm still just very nervous about it. I mean, Southampton we're hitting 116%, and you're down at 80, and it just strikes me as being odd.
And
it's just something.
And the other thing is we also have to think about, for example, we're in critical incident again at the moment, based upon our urgent and emergency performance, or not performance rather, but the urgent and emergency demand that's on us. And so, you know, there are days where sometimes we can walk down to get a coffee and we can actually see the other end of the corridor. More often than not, it's closed because we're having to utilise capacity. So I think we have to. It is. I invite you to come and visit.
Love to.
But to actually explore the very questions that you're asking, because they are the questions that we're asking ourselves, and we'd really value the opportunity to talk them through with fresh pairs of eyes.
I mean, just on that point as well, which is not here, which I think would be really useful to have here, is also the non-criteria to reside position, because, you know, I mean, just like everywhere else, I mean, that's completely screwing up the flow of patients. I mean, you've got 117 patients with non-criteria to reside. It's just untenable.
Non-criteria to reside fluctuates between maybe 18 to 27% of our bed capacity.
Yeah. It's just,
I think, Dave, you put your finger on very impressively for a debut some very, very salient points. If we broaden that discussion more widely beyond elective care, and we had a conversation about urgent and emergency care and the use of the virtual ward, etc., it would be even more interesting. I think it would be really useful for you to visit South and to talk to John and colleagues about your experiences and see what you can help us with. We'll be arranging your induction programme with added gusto as a result of your observations. And it'd be good for you to talk to Claire as well, of course, about some of the strategies.
And we picked quite a bit of that up through Finance Committee already, and if there's more we can add to that to enrich the discussion, then happy to do that.
Thank you. Interesting. Any other points that people want to raise? Claire, on the money, I mean, what's the plan? Because some of you were closeted away this morning thinking about this. What happens next? Because our position is unsustainable. It's unacceptable. Some aspects of the increased overspend are difficult for us to manage. We accept that, but others we would argue are manageable. So for those which we can control and manage, what are we doing about them? That's a question as much as anything for the providers around the table, but I'm asking just through Claire for now.
That's fine. So we agreed a set of actions this morning, as I said, that focus on the real thorny areas actually, predominantly the areas that we collectively as a system can influence together. So as I mentioned, some of the activity assumptions, but also the escalation and how we try and de-escalate and reduce associated cost. There's also commitment from all of us to go back and make sure that we can confidently describe mitigations within our positions, whether that be through delivery of our internal cost improvement plans or other measures that we're taking. Plan at the moment is that Rob Cooper, who's been providing some interim financial recovery support, and Lorna will do the rounds next week in terms of action owners and organisations to chase progress and make sure that we're on top of the actions that are required. And then in 2 weeks' time at the next Chief Execs meeting, we're going to widen the attendance again for DOFs and COOs to make sure that we follow up on those actions, the product of which will be our assessment of what we believe the forecast will look like, which will then enable us to take that into discussion with NHS England about managing through to the end of the year.
And I presume there's a general view that a straight line forecast is just not acceptable, and that we need to really claw that back. We need to start getting into something akin to positive run rate at the earliest opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also alongside that, we've got a parallel piece of work to make sure that we're not just looking at this year, because we fall into that trap of chasing a number to year end. So we've got a paper going to Finance Committee in the next week or so, next week, which starts to unpack some early scenario modelling around the medium-term financial plan, which will also then start to underpin conversations about next year and what that looks like.
And in terms of arguing for any additional income, are we as prepared as we need to be for that?
When you say arguing for additional income?
Well, I presume it's linked to the elective activity that Dave was alluding to.
Yes. So there are various aspects to the conversation that we had this morning. Some is about access to national money, that we're challenging the guidance and the rules around to see if we can attract that. We know that there is more guidance due around how ERF might be changed because of industrial action. We haven't seen it yet, so we'll continue to lobby for that along with every other system. And then there's a piece of work that we're just completing, which is to triangulate the system-wide view of overall elective activity and the earning potential there with individual organisation views to make sure that we're absolutely aligned in terms of where that money comes in and where it goes.
I'm nervous about many aspects of this, as I know you are. The notion of not having another board discussion about this until November is a bit disconcerting, and I just wondered how you would imagine, how colleagues would imagine the board would be engaged in the emerging thinking about the plan, any revisions, etc. between now and then.
In terms of the forecast out?
Yeah. And the actions that have been taken.
Yeah, so we're expecting the release of national protocol or updated protocol around how we secure agreement for any changes to forecast outturn. So at the moment I'm working on the basis that we go with last year's rules, because I can't imagine they're going to materially change. We will manage the conversation to a point through Finance Committee. As I say, we've got one next week, which is actually the September meeting, but just because of diaries it fell into October. We've also got our normal October meeting at the end of October. By then I'm hoping that through the conversations I'm already having with NHS England, we'll have a view on their expectation of locking something down. Whether that means we need to call an extraordinary board meeting to consider that, whether we can tie it into the development session that we've already got planned in the intervening period, we might just need to be a bit flexible about that until we understand a bit more about what we've got.
I mean, the Finance Committee, Trevor, will have an important part to play in this, and Dave, you've been appointed in part to be a member of that committee and to support Trevor in its work. So that's a degree of reassurance I have. But Dave, did you want to add anything?
Just very briefly, I don't know what. So Hampshire and the Isle of Wight is also on the naughty step. Actually on the higher naughty step than STW.
That's not possible.
And so we were asked. Hampshire and the Isle of Wight was asked to submit a formal transformation plan last week, actually, to NHS England. We haven't been asked to do that here.
Part of enacting the protocol will be for us to formally describe that recovery plan between now and the end of the year. So the work that I've described that's already underway will feed that presentation basically, and will be then handed over for discussion.
That's helpful. Simon?
I was just only going to say, if we think about what we're going to cover in the October board development session, we talk about the winter plan. The winter plan's about escalation, which is about capacity, which links to workforce. So I think there's absolutely opportunity in that agenda to pull out the financial aspects, because the escalation bit then linked to the capacity to drive activity that we've been talking about this morning. We've been talking about the workforce agenda, so I would intend, I think, for us to bring that out in that session as well, recognising that's not in public, but if we need to formally submit something, we can pick that up. But I think there's an opportunity in that space, Chair.
Let's move on. Some challenging times in terms of performance, but some good news in terms of elective and long waits, which is very encouraging. The next item is system mortality metrics. You remember at the beginning of the meeting I said that the reason why the board papers were late was because we had realised that a paper, i.e. the system mortality metrics paper, required more explanation than we had given, and it needed to be set within a context of the overall, I suppose, approach that we want to take for service improvement and safety, and also surveillance, the means whereby we can track improvements, and we can also track trends and concerns that we thereby need to act upon. We've apologised for some of the ways in which we described the paper. We've apologised for the concern It's given to some families who had very, very unfortunate experiences in Saturn with the subject of the Ockenden inquiry. So what we need to do now is focus on the issues that the paper actually draws to our attention. We've been thinking about this for some time. It needs to be part and parcel of the business rhythm of the ICS and the ICB. This is the first opportunity for us just to start thinking about some of the metrics that are available to us, and to start thinking about how we use them and the kind of actions that might arise as a result. I'm going to ask Nick to introduce the paper and say any more about the issues that I've just described, and then we can have a discussion about what next.
Yep. Thank you, Chair. So, yeah, as you said, mortality surveillance is a core part how we, as a system, can assess the safety of services we offer and also identify those areas where we need to improve. Classically, it's been done at organisational level, such as a provider trust, and now we're in a position to do it as a system-wide level, looking at the entire patient journey and how we can really be effective for the entire population, not just episodes of population care, so episodes of patient care. So the first slide is an example of classically how we've always done mortality surveillance for trusts. The Standards Hospital Mortality Indicator, or SHIMI, is a measure of death within a hospital or 30 days after discharge. It's been well established, robust. Here we're giving the saffron as an example, which shows that the mortality rate is where we'd expect it to be for patients entering hospital within 30 days of discharge. The next slide starts to look at population level data for the first time, and it's doing it by diagnosis group, and it's looking at the expected deaths and actually the observed number of deaths. They approximately match where they should be, but it does help us start to identify those areas which we're performing well in, but more importantly those areas where we may be underperforming in. And the examples given here are stroke and respiratory conditions such as aspiration pneumonitis. It also gives us an opportunity to look at paediatric level data, and I'm going to reiterate what Neil said. We do need to apologise for some of the terms we used in describing data. Yes, they're numbers on the page, but each number is a child which has died, and any death of a child is a completely devastating experience for the people involved. And the information percentage in this slide does show that we do have a higher mortality rate than the national average. It does vary considerably from year to year, and we are dealing with, very fortunately, very small numbers of deaths, which can shift whether it's above or below average quite rapidly. However, that said, it's important to note that we do have currently more child deaths than we'd like to see. It also allows us to look at the variation as we start to categorise things, and as we've heard in the conversation earlier around GP access. There is significant variation in mortality gaps relating to deprivation, economic deprivation, and the lowest and worst off families within the system, the mortality rate is higher than national average, and for the better off quintiles, 20% blocks, mortality rate is where we'd expect it to see, or even better. So this really gives a clear indication of the health inequalities work which you need to progress. It's a really important piece of information. Again, it's reflected in some of the adult data we can look at. With the covering note, there's some of the definitions which we're using for terms such as leading cause mortality or premature mortality. So the data we get at population level is quite often divided by local authorities, and it shows that in Shropshire, overall the leading cause mortality is roughly expected to be, but it does show that women having stroke, female stroke mortality is an outlier. Similarly, if you look at premature mortality, which is people dying before we would expect them to, it does show there's an outlier for generally a good performance in Shropshire, but there's an outlier for severe mental illness. There's people dying of physical health conditions who we know have severe mental illness. Looking at the other half of the system, Telford and Wrekin, the picture's not as good in general, and again it does reflect the situation with inequalities, the population there, particularly around economic deprivation. And it does highlight some issues around cardiac disease and respiratory disease. Again, that's also reflected if you look at premature mortality as well. And similarly, there's this same picture we see with severe mental illness. However, if you look at the preventable mortality, this is where prevention work of public health colleagues does show that there's a good performance for both Shropshire and Telford and Wrekin when it comes to preventable mortality. So there's some good news and some positive stories in this. Looking at some of the issues we've seen earlier relating to respiratory disease, cardiac disease and stroke, we can look at our tobacco control profile. There's good evidence available now to show how effective some of our interventions are. However, it does show that it is potentially scope to improve, so tobacco use being a key driver of premature mortality for respiratory disease, stroke, cardiovascular conditions. And it does show there is some variations in practice between the two local authorities. Scope for further improvement, but it does show we can capture really good level of data about what we could perhaps do. I touched on cardiac, and a key component of the clinical strategy is improving our cardiac pathways for the entire patient journey, from prevention, initial presentation to primary care, diagnosis, treatment within hospital, and then discharge and long-term follow-up. And this can be split into, the areas of early detection and treatment is a key pillar of the clinical strategy going forward. As is the acute treatment within a hospital setting. The enhancement of how we do discharge and ongoing management better, and particularly around the medication we give our patients. The mortality statistics, they lag. When talking about people dying of heart disease, it's what's happened 10 years previously, which is being reflected in this year's figures. Over the last 2 years, there's been a lot of effort within our system pharmacy team to make sure people are on the right drugs when it comes to stroke and cardiac medication. It's around control of hypertension, anticoagulation, and also for atrial fibrillation. Currently, we feel for that group of patients, as of today, the ones we know about are on appropriate medication, whereas a group of people who we've yet to diagnose, and that again is reflected in the health equalities part of what we need to look at is making sure we reach out to the communities, to the particular places we can identify, to make sure that we're having appropriate access to care within primary care and being on the right medication. The last bit I highlighted was around serious mental illness, and Neil's unfortunately with us. MPUFT has a considerable amount of work they're doing around the area. Some of it's actually award-winning. And key to this is actually doing physical health screening for patients with known serious mental illness, which is ongoing. We've now got a good screening, but its next step is to make sure those physical health issues we identify, we actually help the patients with. So that's in summary, is a paper. There's a lot in there, and it's the first time we've presented it. I think it's really important we openly and transparently look at this level of data so we can have a clear idea of our performance and we can focus our efforts going forward.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick. Let me open it up and see if there are any questions or comments. Bearing in mind this is the first time, and this is going to become part of our routine, and it's meant to highlight areas that require much more detailed investigation, which we will do. But bearing all of that in mind, I think, Dave, you're first and then Niti?
Sorry, I didn't realise it was the first time coming. I suppose the key thing for me is that we don't just put it and lose it, and we actually do something about it. So, I mean, because whilst there are one or two particular pockets on the mortality data that we do need to look at, the one thing that I found especially worrying was a stark difference on a public health level between Shropshire and Telford and Wrekin. I mean, they are quite dramatically different if you look at that profile, and I'd be concerned about where are we going with that, what are we doing with that.
Thank you, and we've heard that theme on other agenda items. Ian's made the point, and our colleagues from Telford Local Authority have also. John, did you want to come in? I was going to draw you.
I'd share that. I would make some comments and perhaps even some advice and guidance about what the next steps might be.
Do you want to just hold on to that for a moment in terms of comments on the next steps, and we bring in other people first? Is that all right? Or would you rather?
I'm happy on whatever you
Okay, just hold on to your thoughts for now. Let's bring in Niti and Cathy and Patricia.
Just quickly on the, thank you, Nick. Thank you for a very coherent report. Really nicely done. Thank you very much. Just quickly on the outliers on stroke and your cardiac pathway that you've talked about. Again, this probably will be picked up in the next steps, but I'm particularly concerned about the hypertension pathway rather than the cardiac pathway. It's the one quick, easy hit that you can do with great impact in terms of how you do it. And I would be quite interested to hear about how we're going to focus on something that creates the biggest impact quickly.
Thank you. Let's just hold on to these points for now. I think, Cathy, you might have been next, and then Patricia.
So I wanted to say to Nick, thank you very much for this report, but I was thinking about it wider, about how do we engage our places and our our populations, not only to engage with this, but also about helping to come up with some solutions for that. And what are we doing to try to engage them? So I know that in Whitchurch we've set up our own health and social care forum, which is part of Whitchurch Town Council. I know Oswestry has done as well. So there are places that are already starting to think about what can we do to help ourselves. And I was wondering how this could be used to help those groups establish more in the community.
Thank you. And Patricia.
Yeah, again, I think your point about this is the start of the conversation, and I think it is important that we're pulling together that mortality data that has, as Nick was saying, previously presented at an organisational level. And what we do know in terms of mortality and indeed morbidity is that's driven by a number of other key factors. So seeing this report in light of JSNA, the fantastic public health data that we've got across both councils to actually set the scene, both in terms of prevention but also in terms of the learning around mortality figures, because your point around in some areas we're higher than the national average, but then you look at some of the smoking elements. We know from the data and information that we've got higher levels of amputees and renal dialysis as a result of type 2 diabetes. There's a real issue there for us in terms of that this might be a trigger to look at the prevention agenda in a much bigger way, to look at the reduction of mortality where we know that we can make those differences, as well as a reduction in morbidity as well. So I think this is a much broader piece of work to understand the context and therefore know how we, what problem we're trying to solve in a systematic and appropriate way.
Thank you. Ian?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think this highlights, from previous discussion and this paper, it highlights the important how we continue to look at de-risking segments or cohorts of patients. But this cannot be done simply using the clinical means by clinical pathways. These issues are largely multifactorial, so it has to be an element where the non-clinical part comes into play here. If you look at the combined deprivation index in Telford compared to 2015 and 2019, it hasn't changed. In fact, it's got worse. So the issue of deprivation has been there long term, but the manifestation of the poor health outcome is increasing. So I'm glad that we have a joint forward plan. We also have a sound clinical strategy that is specific to these areas of focus, such as cardiovascular disease and diabetes. But I cannot stress enough the importance of place-based work in addressing this and the focus of non-clinical element. Because why I mention this is because I've seen time after time there are patients who suffer from type 2 diabetes with poorly controlled diabetes and end up having amputation. The entire patient journey is not simply about medication. It's about what are the causes that they don't comply so well and what are the issues causing them to be non-engaging, which a large proportion of these individuals end up having this amputation. So it's not one for non-trying in primary care or in secondary care or in community trust. We've done everything, but these things are still happening. Why is that? It's not about the clinical aspect.
Thank you very much indeed. I mean, we could keep this conversation running for the rest of the evening. And I wanted to bring in Meredith because this plays directly into the quality orbit for which you have an oversight. What did you want to say about this?
Okay, just very briefly. We all of the detail that we've heard about is important, but one of the key drivers is our assurance system. So exactly. We can have lengthy conversations about what it's saying, but what we're going to do about it, or indeed what is already being done about it. So the Quality and Performance Committee, I'm just going to say very quickly, comprises the executives across our system who are responsible for much of this, and their non-executives, and Public Health from Shropshire and Telford and Wrekin. And our agenda is driven by risk. So our first item on every agenda is the risk register. 3 of the items on our risk register have actually been picked up by next report. So there is already a spotlight, and each discussion is around challenge. You said you were going to do this 3 months ago, and it hasn't been done. So there is constant challenge and assurance being provided by that committee. And I think it could do more with more intelligence like this. So we could build up that assurance mechanism to be more muscular, I think, a better word, and actually to say to the members of the committee, so what are you all going to do about it now when you go back to your organisations? I think that is our role that we can definitely play and develop further. I would just like to say, though, that this material, this data, feels like something that should be coming directly here as well. There's always a risk of going to a subcommittee and then drifting away a little bit. So I think this is fundamentally important data that's telling us something about how we run health and care in our area.
Powerful points and very well put, Meredith. And I just, you've taken some of the words out of my mouth. I was going to ask you about the role of your committee in terms of assurance, and you've given me an answer to that. I just wanted to make the point that it must not diminish the responsibilities of boards, primarily for looking at making sure that you know what data is available and that you've got your own surveillance arrangements in place. That's absolutely crucial. And John, I'm sorry, I cut you short earlier, but did you want to kind of give us a view from your organisation's perspective?
Yes, of course, and hopefully I'll finish off with maybe some suggestions about next steps. I think I would like to say a few things about child mortality. I think, whenever we look at reports of this nature, there's a tendency to focus on numbers and ranges. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, all child deaths are tragedies. There should be an expectation that no child should die, and that we should fully understand why any child dies. The impact of a child dying is profound. Families never recover from it, and they particularly never recover from it if they feel that things could have been done differently. And I think we've got to hold that in our mind whenever we're considering anything in relation to children. These sorts of things shouldn't happen to children. Sometimes they happen, and it's something that was unavoidable. That doesn't change the principle that we should consider that children should not die, and if children die, we should understand why. Now, obviously, this is data that we've seen across the system, and I'm more used to looking at information relating to our hospital. But if it's helpful, I'll talk a little bit about how we approach, particularly if we look at child mortality, how we have and continue to approach it. And I know that the people on the board who take part in the programmes of work that we've been doing for a number of months know the answer to this. But so neonatal mortality. So in terms of a secondary care provider of maternity services, we get different information. So we get information from an organisation called Embrace, and what that describes is mortality of babies born in our hospital, but die in the neonatal period, so up to 28 days after delivery, wherever that might be. And that, because, of course, with specialist centres, many of those babies sadly die outside of our system, and importantly away from their homes. So, and it's true that if you look at neonatal mortality across the whole of the West Midlands, neonatal mortality is high across the west of the Midlands compared to the rest of the country, and has been for some time. And our neonatal mortality, based on the description I've just given, is also high locally as well. And although all neonatal deaths have a systematic way of being reviewed to see if we can understand exactly what happened and what we could have done differently, I don't think that is sufficient to explain what is happening in the West Midlands, and is sufficient to understand what's happening, certainly in babies born in our trust. We have, locally, as a consequence of that, we have actually got quite a lot of external expertise looking at our neonatal mortality over the last couple of years. It's coincided helpfully in me being able to comment on some of the information that you've heard today. So that's how we address and understanding neonatal mortality and then continue to do that. Paediatric mortality, if you go wider, and if I've understood the data that Nick receives and is presented today, and I think this is particularly relevant to hearing about place and some of the things we heard earlier about deprivation. So I think, Nick, the data particularly you're presenting is related to the National Childhood Mortality Database. So if the National Childhood Mortality Database, they produced a report in 2021 which looked nationally at mortality, particularly with a focus on deprivation. And about 30% of deaths in childhood, it has awful terminology, but essentially there are potentially modifiable things related to deprivation that may make a difference. And that could be a whole range of things. So if you happen to look at that paper, you'll see a whole range of things from sort of medical type things like vitamin D deficiency, right through to overcrowding in homes and even access to language services. So a whole load of things under that umbrella of deprivation, all things that can be modified, that are features of mortality. Of course, in hospitals, we very sadly often look after children in the last minutes, days, or hours of their lives, and so my mind's very much focused on those. And so, in some ways, our approach in hospital, as those of you who are part of it around the table, will know that we take an approach which we've learned from how we've approached the learnings through our maternity review. So we set up a transformation program, essentially. We gather everything we can possibly find in relation to things that might influence paediatric mortality. So there's the outcome of investigations that we carried out, serious incident investigations. There's the outcome of visits that we invite into our hospital, and there's the outcomes of staff surveys. And so we've got a program of work at the moment which takes into account all those inputs, if you like, and puts together a program of work with a very clear assurance part of it, which is where obviously board members have been part of. And we're already seeing some really key changes that have been made as a consequence of that, which I'm sure will be helpful. You'll note one of the things that we're particularly interested in, because of what we've learned from involving families through maternity, is how do you get the resident or constituent or the patient, how do you get that voice in there? Because within maternity we've got some quite strong maternity voices partnership, thinking about how do you bring that as well into the conversation and the improvement of work. So I think we've still got some thoughts around that. So coming back to what do I think the next steps are, my own thought is if you look at neonatal deaths, for example, within children, I think I would suggest that the board, I'm already quite closely involved with the network, but I would suggest we look to strengthen our links with the network, because I am confident that whatever it is that means that the neonatal mortality is high across the whole of West Midlands will overlap substantially with what we're seeing within our own system, and it makes sense that we don't duplicate work that's already planned. With regard to paediatric mortality, I would suggest looking at some not thinking of deprivation beyond deprivation as a thing. Look at what deprivation means. Look at all the various contributors and what we mean by deprivation. There's probably 20 or 30 different things that the paper is very helpful. Which of those things do we think we can influence the most quickly? And I've mentioned some really quite narrow medical type things that might be possible to focus on. But that's where I would suggest that we start. More broadly, mortality. So what we've learned is that to use as much information as you can possibly gather. So we've got quite a strong learning from death program now, where we use information that comes from a number of different sources. So you have obviously natural data sets different to the data sets obviously the system receives. So you get ranges, you get indicators of where there may be some areas that should be for increased focus. We also have, because of the changes in the coroner's regulations, we have our medical examiner reports. So we get deaths all scrutinised medically. So we get information coming through from medical examiner's reports. The other thing that we have is that for deaths in hospital, we have and I'm going to forget what the letter stands for. We have something called an SJR, Structured Judgment Reviews, which is a systematic way of looking through somebody's care who has died with a toolkit that is good at picking up things that you wouldn't necessarily notice if you just read through somebody's notes. And because we've had quite a lot of investment in the team, that we've seen that really quite a significant proportion of deaths we're able to review. And so and the helpfulness of that, we're not just looking at the deaths that may be part of an incident, we're actually looking at a range, so that because even when you think nothing better, no improvements were there, you'll find some. So it's particularly with big data sets is to try and triangulate it with the other information. So again, I would suggest before launching into particularly related to that one data set, I would suggest taking an approach similar to what I've described in terms of our learning. And I know our learning from deaths team will be very happy to support how we look at a similar approach across the system. So I hope that's helpful.
That's really helpful.
In accepts of things, but I'm happy to comment any further.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much indeed. We were hoping that this would spark a discussion about what we should do next and how we should improve, and I think it's actually delivered just that. Dave, did you want to come in?
Just one thing. I think the one of the things I think will almost certainly come out of the Letby inquiry is how do we speed up the recognition of patterns? Because look, the shimmy data is really useful, but there's a long time lag on a shimmy data, and so statistical analysis of patterns of death, I think, will almost certainly come through.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, look, I know. Sorry, John. Did you want to
comment on that? So, I think unfortunately you can't rely on statistics, because I think that the difficulty is that one, statistics take a long time, and the other thing, often by the time the numbers of people, constituents, residents that you're talking about are often quite small, and you'll have to wait an awful long time to see a pattern. I think from our experience in trying to step in early when you think there's a pattern, and I think this will be helpful with PSERV. So PSERV, for those of you who don't know, I'm sure most people on the table know, the new patient safety framework that's replacing the current SI framework does encourage a thematic approach to learning. So I know, for example, when we've looked at where we believe, we haven't got stats, but we believe we've seen a couple of instances very similar. I think we take torsion of the testis, for example, and delayed diagnosis of torsion of the testis, is you don't wait for stats to tell you that there's something. If you feel that there is, look at something in a thematic way, and I think PSERV will encourage that, and certainly that's been our approach anyway.
Okay, look.
I've got one quick point, Neil, just one very, very quick point. We just heard the patient safety, we heard the experience of failing care for somebody. I think triangulating patient experience data with patient safety and clinical effectiveness, like the way Peter Pronovost does in the Armstrong Institute of Patient Safety, is something we've absolutely got to do.
It's a fascinating and really important discussion. I hope board members take some reassurance by the breadth of work that's already underway and the depth of inquiry that takes place to help understand deaths in providers and across the whole of the system. We need to bear in mind that mortality and its causes is not just about hospitals, it's about a whole range of facets, really, that we've heard about. Deprivation is a part of that. And what I'm really pleased about is that we've given this an airing for the first time. But what I'm going to do, Simon, is ask you just to, perhaps with Nick, just a summary of what we do next, because this has to be a constant theme of our board discussions. This is not just one-off. And as somebody said earlier, how do we make sure that the discussion we've had today doesn't kind of drift off and get lost in the sand dunes somewhere? So Simon, what's your view? How do we manage this going forward?
Okay, so really helpful conversation, and I think it falls into a number of strands and responsibilities. And of course, as a board, our responsibility is to make sure that we seek assurance and that we've got the confidence in that assurance, and that we use the right mechanisms to do that when we need to drill down into a level of detail. So what do I mean by that? Listening to the conversation, listening to the discussion, there is first and foremost the statutory responsibility of each board and each statutory organisation in our system to be looking at the data, to making sure that it's using its own governance structures, as John's articulated, as others articulated, and for each board that has a chief exec and chair represented around this table, to be making sure that that's visible, that's done transparently, and that's looked at. From a system perspective then, and of course within that, there is the triangulation aspect that John's talked about, that Nitty's talked about, thematic aspect that Dave's talked about, where to do that, yes, there's the statistical data that gives you an indication, but actually what are staff saying, what is incident reporting telling us, what does that look like? So there's a statutory board responsibility within that space. At a system level then, Meredith has really clearly and really articulately set out the quality oversight and governance role from a system level. And of course, as a board, we need to look to that committee to give us that assurance that it's working with each of the provider boards and across the system to look at the risks and to look at the patterns and to look at the information that comes from that, and both to deal with that through the committee, but also to escalate and bring through to the board the areas where there's the concern. And I think Meredith set out how that might get strengthened and what that looks like, and I think we need to pick that up. So Nick and Alison, Vanessa on Alison's behalf, I ask that we work with Meredith to pick that up, please. And then I think there's the strands that we've got into that aren't solved just from an NHS perspective, which gets us into the deprivation aspect that Patricia flagged in terms of the JSNA, our approach to population health, and the clear variation that exists across our system, where we need to get into the place-based work of actually genuinely, if the system is to add value around what we do to tackle health inequalities, if this data doesn't indicate the areas where we need to get into wider partnership working to tackle health inequalities, there isn't going to be another paper that will do that. And so the mobilisation of our approach towards tackling health, reducing health inequalities, our approach to prevention, primary prevention, secondary prevention, tertiary prevention, in a systematic way across our system, using the evidence and the data to target that in the right way, that has that clinical strategy underpinning it, which is one element, but is much broader because it requires local authorities, it requires education, it requires police, it requires local employers to play their part in that, is an important strand as well. So for me, Neil, there are at least 5 strands that fall through this, that come from board responsibility and governance for the specific detail, a quality oversight that's a system level, and then the population health and equality prevention approach that we've talked about, all based on triangulation of data and not relying just on statistics. So I think we need to make sure we structure our work around what we've heard to make sure that we've got that clarity and we've got that focus.
Thank you. Nick?
I'm just going to expand to Simon's points. First is, as an integrated care system, a group of partners around the table outside healthcare and outside of healthcare, we have to, have an aspiration to deliver that wider view of, life terms health. We've got to really push that. And as an ICB, ICS, we should now see ourselves as enabled to start that journey. That's got to be, if people ask what's a vision, that's got to be part of our vision. And the second bit is, second piece of Simon's comments is around, what we've heard around diabetes and cardiac and, how we can improve the health of our population that way, and population health management. I think this work really needs to inform what we could call a long-term condition strategy. As a part of our population, we could start to identify the places where they live who do have long-term healthcare conditions, and I think that does need to be a real focus of our attention.
Thank you very much indeed. And bear in mind also that this report has highlighted 2 or 3 key areas and one particular area of concern for which we owe it to people to describe what we're doing as a result. And I thought, John, your description of the various steps and actions that you take within SAF were hugely helpful about that. But we ought to be able to say what we're planning to do, and preferably by when, to explain those kind of presentations, really. I predict that we'll be having even more discussions about this kind of thing in future. Some of them will recur, some of them will be new, and we will also, I believe, be taking more and more assurance about knowing what the lie of the land actually is in terms of using mortality as an indicator. So thank you very much indeed, Nick, John and others for your contributions. Katrina.
Just reflecting actually on what Meredith was saying, I think the real opportunity of the Quality and Safety Committee at the ICB level is that triangulation, because we see it through an acute lens, etc., etc. The committee which pulls all these lenses together is the real opportunity to identify things that otherwise we might be missing. So I think duplication, no thank you. Triangulation, real additive value. I think we could have a great, real quality move on this.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, I would have escaped your notice that it's after 5 o'clock and that there are still some items to transact. I'm going to ask a question of you, Simon, and you, Nick, in terms of the Shaping the Shropshire, Telford and Wrekin ICB, and also the GMC Responsible Organisation. Are you happy that we note those reports?
Absolutely.
From my paper.
Mine's effectively a nil report, even though we've now been designated responsible organisation.
Excellent.
Connections.
So the precedent has been set for this kind of discussion, this kind of item in future, rather than reserving time for discussion. We will note it. John.
Yeah, only because I'm a responsible officer at SAF. Just a comment, really. Just even if you haven't
for the GMC.
Yeah, I'm the GMC responsible for SAF. Only to say, just although even if you haven't got any doctors connected to your designated body, I think that's the situation currently. Just to note that there is a series of requirements around being confident about the fitness to practice the doctors that do work within your organisation. So it's not just about whether you've got any doctors connected, but I'm sure.
Yeah, and I think that's reflected in the paper.
One of the strengths of medical directors, they're all employed elsewhere in clinical roles, so those being their clinical experience and leadership role, they do have leadership role, robust training organisation.
And then just moving on, thank you very much indeed to the board committee reports. Are the chairs who are present happy for us to note their content on this occasion? Everybody content with that? Thank you very much indeed. And then any other business? I've not had any notified, so I hereby declare the meeting closed. Thank you all very much indeed for your forbearance. Thank you.